Welcome back, my dear traveler. Tonight, we journey deep into one of the oldest and most enduring stories of Middle-earth, the complete history of the dwarves, those stubborn, magnificent, stone-hearted children of the mountains, whose tale stretches from the very first days of creation all the way to the fading of the world as we know it. I am so glad you are here. Settle in now. Find your coziest spot, whether that is tucked beneath a warm blanket, curled against a soft pillow, or simply lying still with the quiet of the night wrapped around you like a cloak. Let the day go. Let its worries and its noise dissolve, the way a fire slowly dims to embers when the last log has burned through. You do not need to hold on to anything tonight. Just let yourself be carried gently and slowly through one of the most remarkable civilizational stories ever woven into the fabric of a secondary world. Take a slow, deep breath now, in through your nose. Hold it for just a moment and let it fall away through your mouth. Good. And another. Feel the tension in your shoulders release just a little. Feel your jaw unclench, your hands soften, your legs grow heavy against whatever is beneath you. You are safe here. The night is long, and so is this story. And there is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do except listen and breathe and slowly, softly drift. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Imagine yourself standing at the great stone doors of Khazad-dûm, the ancient hall that men would one day call Moria. The air around you is cool, not cold, but carrying that deep subterranean chill that stone holds even in summer. Even when the surface world is bright and warm, you can feel the immensity of the mountain above you, the weight of Sigil and Bundushathur and Barazinba pressing down through 10,000 feet of rock. The darkness before you is not threatening, it is ancient. It hums with something you cannot quite name, the memory of hammers, the echo of voices long since stilled, the faint and distant smell of forge smoke from fires that burned 1,000 years ago. The stone walls rise around you like the bones of the earth itself, carved with knotwork and angular runes, every surface speaking of hands that knew exactly what they were doing, hands that had shaped the mountain from within as though it were clay. You breathe in, and you can almost taste the mineral richness of the deep places, the damp and the darkness that the dwarves called home. This is where their story lives, in the stone, in the deep places, in the enduring and the immovable. Before we continue much further, I want you, my weary listener, to leave a comment and tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is for you. I love hearing from you, whether you are in the middle of a sleepless night, winding down after a long day, or somewhere in the in-between. You are part of this community, and knowing where you are listening from makes this journey feel all the more shared. Now then, let us begin at the very beginning. Not the beginning of the Third Age, not the beginning of the Great Wars, but the absolute cosmological beginning, the moment before the dwarves existed at all, when Middle-earth was still young and the Valar were still shaping its bones. In the lore of Tolkien's world, the dwarves did not come into being the way the elves did. The elves were the firstborn, the children of Ilúvatar, awakened by the one god himself at the shores of a lake called Cuiviénen in the far east of Middle-earth, under stars that had never yet seen the light of sun or moon. They arose as Ilúvatar had always intended, in his own time and according to his own design. The dwarves, however, were something different altogether. They were, in the most precise theological sense of Tolkien's mythology, an unauthorized creation, though that phrase does not quite do justice to the love and the craft that went into them. Aulë was his name, one of the great Valar, the powers of the world, who had been set by Ilúvatar to shape and adorn the earth. Aulë was the smith, the craftsman, the one whose delight was in the making of things, in ore and mineral, in the deep geology of the world, in the pleasure of a hammer's swing and the satisfying ring of metal shaped to purpose. He loved the physical substance of ardor more deeply than perhaps any other of the Valar, and he poured that love into his work without reservation. He was the one who taught craft and smithwork to many who came after him, who inspired the Noldor elves in their love of making, and who delighted in the very bones of the world that he and his fellow Valar had labored to shape. But Aulë was impatient. This is the word Tolkien uses, and it is the right word, not malicious, not arrogant in the way of Melkor, but simply impatient in the way of a craftsman who sees a beautiful material and cannot wait to do something with it. He had heard, in the great music that preceded creation, the Ainulindala, the music of the Ainur, that the children of Ilúvatar would come into being, that there would be speaking, thinking, rational creatures upon the earth who would know and love it. And he was eager. He did not want to wait for that far-off moment when the elves would finally awaken in the east. He wanted companions now, beings who could learn from him, who would share his love of stone and craft, who would understand the deep language of the mountains, and so he made them in secret. Picture him there in some deep place of the early world. The precise location is never given, but we can imagine it easily enough. A great underground forge, the rock glowing warm in the light of fires that Aulë had kindled himself, the air thick with the smell of worked metal and cooling stone. And there, with hands that could shape the very substance of the world, Aulë made 7 figures, 7 proto-dwarves, formed from stone and given something that looked like life, that moved when he willed them to move and spoke when he prompted them. But they were not truly alive, not in the deepest sense. They were puppets. He knew it even as he made them, because only Ilúvatar could give the gift of true independent existence, the flame of true sentience, the capacity to act and think and feel without their maker's constant will behind them. He kept them hidden. He made for them a kind of body language, a set of features. He imagined them as he wanted them to be, short and stocky, enduring and strong, capable of withstanding great hardship, set apart from the frailties of the other races. He gave them their characteristic form, broad shoulders, deep chests, thick limbs, faces that could weather cold and heat and the grinding labor of the deep mines. He made them to last. He made them, in a sense, like good stonework, built not for elegance alone, but for endurance, for the long duration, for outlasting whatever the world might throw at them. And then Ilúvatar saw what Aulë had done. Of course he saw. He sees all things in the theology of Tolkien's world, and there was never any possibility that this secret work could remain hidden. But his response, and this is one of the most tender moments in all of the Silmarillion, his response was not fury. It was sorrow, yes, and a kind of gentle correction, but woven through with understanding and even compassion. He spoke to Aulë, and his words were at once a reproof and a question. Why have you done this? You know that these creatures cannot truly live, that they cannot act except as extensions of your own will, that they are no more than elaborate puppets. Is this what you intended? And Aulë, to his profound credit, did not argue, did not justify himself, did not attempt to hide behind his good intentions. He simply agreed. He wept. He acknowledged that what he had done was wrong, that he had exceeded the boundaries of his authority, that only Ilúvatar had the right and the power to create true life, and he raised his hammer there in that deep forge to destroy what he had made. This is the moment of grace in the story, because as Aulë raised his hammer to unmake the 7 figures he had so lovingly crafted, Ilúvatar spoke again, and his voice was changed. The correction was complete. The pride had been broken, and Ilúvatar, seeing the genuineness of Aulë's remorse, seeing that the creation had arisen not from the desire for power, but from an excess of love, from the longing of a craftsman to share his joy, Ilúvatar made a gift. He breathed into those 7 figures the flame of true life. He gave them independent existence, genuine thought, the capacity to act of their own will, to feel their own joys and sorrows, to have their own desires and dreams, but with conditions, with the crucial constraint that would shape all of dwarven history. The dwarves would not be permitted to awaken and walk the earth until after the firstborn, until after the elves had arisen. Ilúvatar said this clearly. His children were to come first, and the dwarves must sleep and wait. And he said something else as well, something that would prove prophetic in the ages to come, that the dwarves would be hard to sway from their own purposes, that they would not easily bend, that they would endure griefs and stubbornness alike with equal fortitude. Aulë accepted this with gladness. He took his 7 newly living dwarves, who were at that moment still in a kind of deep sleep, waiting for the appointed time, and he hid them away in various places beneath the mountains of Middle-earth, set them in deep beds of stone, and left them to wait out the long ages until the world was ready for them. Those 7, we learn, were not all kept together. They were set in different locations, in different parts of the world, so that when they finally woke, they would spread across the breadth of Middle-earth, rather than emerging all in one place. We know the names of only some of these original fathers, these fathers of the dwarves, for that is what they are called in the lore. Each one would become the founding patriarch of one of the 7 great kindreds of dwarves. And of these 7 fathers, the most important by far, the one whose line would produce the kings and heroes and great figures we know from the stories, was Durin. His full name was Durin the Deathless, which requires some explanation, because the dwarves were not truly deathless. Ilúvatar had given them long life, longer than men, but not immortality. The name came from a different quality altogether, a quality of return, of reincarnation in a specific and peculiar sense, for it was said of Durin that he would be reborn, that from time to time, into the line of his descendants, there would come a dwarf so like him in spirit and in manner, so reminiscent of the first Durin, that he would be acknowledged by his people as Durin reborn, as the same soul come again into the world. This happened, the lore tells us, 6 times across the long ages of Middle-earth. There were 6 Durins in total, each one separated from the last by ages of time, each one a kind of recurrence of the original spirit. And this pattern of return, this enduring, cyclical, indestructible quality, is what gave the first Durin his title, Deathless, not because he never died, but because he kept coming back. But that is all still far ahead. Let us stay for now at the beginning, in the deep stillness of the first age of the world, when the 7 fathers slept beneath the mountains and the earth was yet unfinished. Breathe slowly now. Let the story settle around you like the cool air of a deep cavern, steady and unhurried. There is no need to rush. The dwarves were waiting, and so can we. The world was still young when those fathers finally stirred. It was still the years of the trees, the Valian age when the 2 trees of Valinor, Telperion and Laureline, the silver and the gold, gave light to the far western land of the Blessed Realm, while Middle-earth lay largely in shadow, lit only by the ancient stars. The elves had long since awakened, had been found by the Vala Orome at Cuivienen, had begun their slow journey westward, their great march toward Valinor. The world was still being shaped in some of its final details, and into this world, one by one, the fathers of the dwarves began to wake. Durin was the first to awaken of all 7. He woke alone, as all the dwarven fathers did, and opened his eyes in a place that had been prepared for him, a deep chamber beneath the mountains of the north, in the range called Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains, or perhaps in the great mountain chain further east. The precise location of his first waking is left somewhat ambiguous in the lore, but what we do know is where he went. He wandered eastward through the still dark world, moving through a Middle-earth that was not yet fully settled, where the shapes of the land were still young and raw, and eventually he came to a mountain. Zirac-Zegil, the dwarves would call it, Celebdil, in the language of the Elves, the Silvertine, one of 3 great peaks of the misty mountains clustered together in that long spine of rock that ran north to south down the middle of the western world. And there, at the feet of those mountains, Durin found a valley, a beautiful valley, shaded by trees, watered by a clear lake, whose surface was so still and perfect that when he looked into it, he saw not only his own reflection, but Above his reflection, the stars of the night sky, the stars of Varda's great handiwork mirrored in the water, as though the sky itself lay beneath the surface of the lake. He named that lake Khaled-dûm, the Mirror-mere, and he named the valley Azanul-bizar, the dim-rilled dale, and in the living rock of the mountains around him, he began to build. This is the founding moment of dwarven civilization, dear traveler. This is the moment from which everything flows. Durin, alone at first, discovering his place in the world, and beginning with his own hands the work that would define his entire race for all the ages to come. He found the deep places of Ziraxigil and Barazinbar, Caradras the Red Horn, and Bundushathur, and he began to delve, not destructively, not greedily, not yet, but with the deep, knowing love of a craftsman who recognizes what he has found, a mountain of extraordinary richness, a place where the stone itself seemed to invite the work of shaping hands. Others came. This is how it always went for the dwarves. They gathered, they found one another, they built communities. Whether it was other dwarves already awake and wandering, or whether more of his kind were born in the early centuries, the sources do not tell us precisely. But Durin was not alone for long. Around him grew the first community, the first settlement of that long dynasty that would bear his name. Durin's folk, the Longbeards, the line that would produce more kings and heroes and famous names than perhaps any other of the seven kindreds. And the settlement they built was unlike anything that had existed before. Over generations, over centuries, they dug deeper and deeper into the mountains, creating not merely a mine or a cave system, but a city, an immense, planned, architecturally sophisticated city of stone, of halls and pillars and bridges and staircases, of chambers great enough to swallow whole cathedrals and corridors that stretched for miles through the living rock. They called it Khazad-dûm, the Dwaro-delph, the mansion of the Khazad, of the dwarves, in the language of their own people. It took ages to build. This is worth sitting with for a moment, dear listener. We are not talking about decades. We are talking about ages of the world, the slow, immense labor of generations of dwarves, each one adding to what the last had made, extending the halls downward and upward, creating new levels, connecting chambers, building the great stairways that wound down to the roots of the mountains. It was a project without a fixed endpoint, without a blueprint that could be completed in a single lifetime. It was the ongoing, ever-growing expression of an entire civilization's understanding of what it meant to live in stone. And beneath the mountains they found treasure. Of course they did. Aulë himself had made these mountains, or at least had played a role in shaping the substance of the earth. And there was a theory that the dwarves had often stumbled upon, whispered rather than stated openly, that the richest veins of ore, the deepest deposits of beautiful stone, seemed somehow drawn to the places where the dwarves chose to dig, as though Aulë himself, their maker, had seeded the earth with gifts for his beloved children. Whether this was true or not, the results were undeniable. Khazad-dûm was rich, extraordinarily, almost impossibly rich. Gold and silver, iron and copper, gems of every kind caught in the rock like frozen stars. All of this was there, waiting, and the dwarves found it and worked it with the skill that Aulë had put in their hands from the very moment of their making. But the richest thing of all, the thing that would define Khazad-dûm above every other achievement and every other treasure, was something that existed nowhere else in the world. Mithril, the true silver, the metal that was lighter than steel but harder than it, that could be worked into mail so fine it might pass for silk, that shone with a cool inner light that did not fade, that was incorruptible and beautiful beyond the power of description. Mithril was found only under the misty mountains, only in Khazad-dûm, and the dwarves of Durin's line were the ones who found it and who learned to work it. Its value was incalculable. Eventually it would be worth more than its weight in gold, worth more than gold and silver combined, worth more than almost any other substance in the world, and it belonged, entirely and exclusively, to Khazad-dûm. This gave Durin's folk a position of extraordinary power and prestige among all the peoples of Middle-earth. The other races, men, elves, the other kindreds of dwarves, all had to come to Khazad-dûm if they wanted mithril, and they did want it desperately. The elves especially were drawn to its beauty, to the way it held the light, to its coolness against the skin. The great mithril coat that would one day be given to a small hobbit of the Shire was made from rings of mithril, so pure and fine that it seemed like woven starlight. But that story is still far ahead of us. Let the image of those early halls settle around you now, my weary listener. The amber glow of dwarven forge fires deep in the mountain, the distant ring of hammers, the smell of hot metal and cool stone, the satisfying weight of ancient rock above and below and all around. Can you feel it? The sense of being enclosed? Yes, but not trapped. Enclosed the way a seed is enclosed in earth, the way a bear is enclosed in its winter den. Safe, deep home. The early centuries of Khazad-dûm were a golden time, perhaps the most golden time in all of dwarven history. Durin himself reigned as king, and he was a great king, patient, far-sighted, a builder rather than a conqueror. He had no interest in the surface world's politics, no desire to make war upon his neighbors. He wanted to build and to dig and to trade and to accumulate the kind of deep knowledge that only comes from centuries of working a single craft with complete devotion. He established the traditions of his people, the customs and the laws that would govern dwarven society for all the ages to come. He established the principle of secrecy, the jealous keeping of certain things private, the refusal to teach outsiders the dwarven tongue, the khazad-dûm, which would remain among the most closely guarded cultural secrets of any people in Middle-earth. The khazad-dûm is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is one of the most remarkable aspects of dwarven civilization. It was not a language that evolved organically over time the way most languages do. It was, in the lore, the language that Aulë himself had given to the dwarves, a language created by a Vala for his people, a language of such depth and precision that it was perfectly suited to describing the things dwarves cared most about: the qualities of stone, the grades of ore, the technical vocabulary of smithcraft and mining, the geography of the underground world. And the dwarves kept it absolutely secret. They would not teach it to outsiders under any circumstances. When they dealt with men or elves, they used other languages: Sindarin, the common speech, whatever tongue was current in the world above ground. But among themselves, in their halls, in their ceremonies, in their deepest feelings, they spoke khazad-dûm, and that language was theirs alone. Even their names were secret. Every dwarf had a true name in khazad-dûm, a name given in private, kept private, never spoken to outsiders. The names we know: Thorin, Glóin, Balin, Dwalin, all the famous names of dwarven history. These were outer names, names given in the languages of men for use in the surface world. The real names, the names that mattered, the names carved on dwarven tombs in a script that outsiders could not read, those were never shared. This secrecy was not mere paranoia, though it became more paranoid over time as the dwarves suffered betrayals and persecutions. It was rooted in something deeper, a sense that certain things were sacred, that not everything should be common property, that the innermost life of a people was worth protecting with absolute ferocity. The dwarves had been made by Aulë in secret, and perhaps something of that secrecy was bred into them from the beginning. Beyond their language, the dwarves developed, in those early centuries, a rich material culture of extraordinary quality. Their metalwork was unrivaled in the world. Not even the elves, with all their magical refinement, could match a dwarven craftsman working in his element, with good ore and a proper forge and centuries of ancestral technique behind him. They made weapons and armor. Yes, the dwarves were warlike when they needed to be, and their battle axes and mail coats were famous throughout Middle-earth. But they also made beautiful things: elaborate jewelry set with gems cut to perfection, locks and mechanisms of bewildering intricacy, musical instruments that produced sounds of extraordinary resonance, architectural elements of such geometric precision that they seemed almost impossible impossible to have been made by hand. They were also master stone cutters, of course. The halls of Khazad-dûm were not merely practical spaces, they were works of art. The great pillars were carved with patterns of knotwork and angular geometry, designs that seemed to grow naturally from the stone the way crystals grow, following their own internal logic. The staircases wound in elegant spirals or descended in great broad flights with perfectly cut balustrades. The bridges, especially the later bridges, including the one that would one day be called Durin's Bridge, that thin sliver of stone arching over an abyss, were engineering marvels, constructed without mortar, held in place purely by the precision of the cut stone and the deep understanding of load and tension that the dwarves had accumulated over centuries of practice, and they dug ever deeper. This is the other defining characteristic of Khazad-dûm, its depth. Most peoples, building underground, would have been content to establish themselves at a certain level, close enough to the surface to remain connected to the world above while protected by the rock. The dwarves were not most peoples. They dug down and down and down again, following the veins of mithril ever deeper into the roots of the mountains, creating level after level beneath the earth, each one deeper and darker and more remote from the surface world above. At its height, Khazad-dûm reached depths that no one else had ever approached, depths where the heat of the earth's core could be felt faintly in the rock, where the darkness was absolute and the silence was broken only by the drip of ancient water and the distant, patient sound of the mountain settling into itself. It is in those depths, dear traveler, that the danger would one day come. But we are not yet there. We are still in the age of building, the age of glory, and it is worth lingering here a little longer. Let the gentle rhythm of distant hammers be your lullaby for a moment. The soft, rhythmic sound of metal on stone coming from somewhere deep in the mountain, steady and unhurried, the heartbeat of a civilization at work. Now, while Khazad-dûm grew and the line of Durin extended itself through generation after generation, the other 6 dwarven kindreds were also awakening and establishing themselves across Middle-earth. The Silmarillion gives us very little detail about these other kindreds. They are named and their general regions are indicated, but their individual histories are mostly shadows. What we do know is that they were real and significant. 6 other families of dwarves, each descended from one of the original fathers that Aulë had made, each developing its own character and culture, spread across a wide arc from the mountains of the Blue Mountains in the west to other ranges further east. There were the Firebeards and the Broadbeams, the 2 kindreds whose fathers had been set in the Blue Mountains, in arid Lewin. They built 2 great cities there, Belegost and Nogrod, which would become famous in the first age of the sun and moon as centers of dwarven craft and commerce. There were others, the Iron Fists, the Stiffbeards, the Blacklocks, the Stonefoots, whose fathers had been placed in mountains further east, in ranges that are largely unexplored and unnamed in the published lore, whose histories are even more obscure than those of the Blue Mountain dwarves. Together with Durin's Longbeards, these 7 kindreds constituted the whole of dwarven civilization in its early form. They were not always at peace with one another. The dwarves, as Ilúvatar had warned, were hard to sway from their own purposes, and this quality, so admirable when it came to enduring hardship, had a shadow side when it came to dealing with other peoples, including other peoples of their own kind. Rivalries developed, trade disputes arose. The question of who had the right to work certain veins of ore, or to trade with certain elven kingdoms, or to claim certain regions of mountain as their territory, produced conflicts that were sometimes resolved through negotiation and sometimes through violence. The dwarves were not, despite what their reputation for loyalty might suggest, uniformly peaceful even among themselves. But the greatest conflicts of that first age of the sun were not internal. They were external, and they were terrible. The first age of the world, the first age proper, the age after the sun and moon arose, and the great wars against Morgoth began in earnest, was a time of catastrophic violence across Middle-earth. Morgoth, Melkor in his darkest form, the first Dark Lord, the one beside whom Sauron was only a servant, had established his fortress of Angband in the north, and from Angband He poured out his armies in wave after wave against the elves and men who opposed him. The great wars of that age, Dagor Nuin-Gileath, Dagor Aglareb, Dagor Bragolach, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, these are names of battles that shook the world, that ended kingdoms and destroyed civilizations. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains, Belegost and Nogrod, were drawn into these conflicts, though they tried as long as they could to remain apart from elven politics. They traded with the elves of Beleriand, the great realm west of the Blue Mountains, and in doing so they became entangled in Beleriand's fate. The dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost were craftsmen of extraordinary skill, and the elves knew it, particularly the Noldor, those proud and gifted elven lords who had come from Valinor and brought with them a knowledge of craft that was itself formidable, but who recognized in the dwarven smiths something complementary to their own skills. Trade and cooperation developed, and with it a complicated relationship marked by mutual respect, mutual wariness, and the occasional flash of genuine hostility. The dwarves built the city of Menegroth for King Thingol of Doriath. That is one of the great achievements of dwarven labor in this age. Menegroth, the 1,000 caves, the underground kingdom of the elven king, who wore a silmaril in his crown. This was dwarven work, shaped from the rock by dwarven hands, filled with the artistry of dwarven craftsmen, working alongside elven design. It was a collaboration, one of the few genuine collaborations between the two peoples that left a lasting monument, and it was extraordinary. The descriptions of Menegroth, its vaulted chambers, its carved pillars representing trees, its flowing water, and its hidden gardens, suggests something of what the great dwarven cities must have been like at their height. But the cooperation did not last without trouble. The most significant, most damaging episode of the entire relationship between dwarves and elves in the First Age came at the very end of that age, when things were already falling apart. Thingol of Doriath had in his possession one of the 3 Silmarils, those incomparable jewels made by Feanor that contained the light of the 2 trees around which so much of the tragedy of the First Age revolved. He had hired dwarven craftsmen from Nogrod to set the Silmaril into a necklace, the Noglamir, the necklace of the dwarves. And when the work was done, things went badly wrong. The exact sequence of events is layered and complicated. There are questions about the seductive power of the Silmaril itself, questions about greed and the curse that hung over all things connected with those stones. But what happened was this: the dwarves of Nogrod killed Thingol and attempted to take the necklace with the Silmaril. In response, the surviving elves of Doriath hunted them down and recovered the treasure, though the kingdom of Doriath was left shattered, and the dwarves of Nogrod themselves, carrying the plundered treasure back toward the Blue Mountains, were ambushed and largely destroyed, the treasure cast into the river Askar. It was a disaster for Nogrod, not the final one, but a devastating one, and it poisoned the relationship between dwarves and elves in a way that would never quite heal. The elves remembered what the dwarves had done to Thingol. The dwarves, or at least many of them, nursed their own grievances, feeling that the circumstances had been misrepresented, that the Silmaril's curse had played its part, that the entire affair was more complicated than the elven version allowed. The mutual wariness that had always characterized the relationship was now colored by something darker: actual, recent bloodshed, in which both sides had suffered and both sides felt wronged. Then the First Age ended in the cataclysm of the War of Wrath, when the Valar finally marched from the Blessed Realm in force and brought their power to bear against Morgoth. The resulting war shook the very foundations of the earth. Beleriand, the entire northwestern region of Middle-earth, the land where the great elven kingdoms had stood, where so much of the history of the First Age had played out, Beleriand was destroyed, torn apart, broken up. The sea rushed in and swallowed it, and in a single generation, much of what had been the most densely inhabited and historically rich part of the world simply ceased to exist, swallowed beneath the waves of what would become the Great Sea. The Blue Mountains, Ered Luin, survived, but only just, and only their eastern side. The western parts, where Belegost and Nogrod had stood, were broken and inundated. The 2 great dwarven cities of the First Age were lost. Some of their survivors, Some of the firebeards and broadbeams who had called those cities home made their way east toward Khazad-dûm and were welcomed there by Durin's folk. Others dispersed to smaller settlements, to lesser halls in what remained of the Blue Mountains, to lives diminished compared to what their grandparents had known. The Second Age began in a world that had been fundamentally reorganized. The great landmass of Beleriand was gone. The surviving elves who had not sailed west to the Blessed Realm were mostly gathering in Lindon, the coastal land east of the new shoreline, under the High King Gil-galad. Men were spreading across the world in greater numbers, and the dwarves were regrouping, adapting, figuring out what this remade world meant for them. Khazad-dûm, which had survived the War of Wrath relatively intact, the Misty Mountains were far enough east to have escaped the worst of the destruction, now became even more central to dwarven civilization than it had been before. With Nogrod and Belagost gone, there was really only one dwarven city of the first rank left in the Western world, and that was Khazad-dûm. Durin's folk had always been the most prominent of the seven kindreds, and now that prominence was absolute. The prestige of the Longbeards, combined with the incomparable wealth of the mithril veins, made Khazad-dûm the axis of dwarven civilization in a way it had not quite been before, and in the early Second Age, Khazad-dûm had an extraordinary neighbor. East of the Misty Mountains, in the valley of the River Celebrant, a great elven settlement was growing. The Noldorin smith Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor himself, heir to perhaps the greatest tradition of craft knowledge in elven history, had established himself there, and around him had gathered an enclave of elven craftsmen called Eregion, the land of Holly, and Eregion's craftsmen were intensely interested in the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm were intensely interested in Eregion. The relationship between Eregion and Khazad-dûm in the early Second Age is one of the most beautiful episodes in the whole long history of the two peoples, one of those rare moments when mutual curiosity, mutual respect, and complementary skills overcame the weight of old grievances and produced something genuinely new. The elven smiths of Eregion and the dwarven smiths of Khazad-dûm traded knowledge and techniques across the distance between their two settlements, a distance made shorter by the road that connected them through Moria's western gate. Dwarves walked that road to trade in Eregion and to share what they knew of metallurgy and stonework. Elves walked it in the other direction, bringing their knowledge of enchantment and of the more subtle arts of making. The results were remarkable. The craft knowledge developed in that exchange was unlike anything that had come before, a fusion of the elvish understanding of the relationship between craft and spirit, and the dwarven understanding of the physical properties of materials. It was said that during this period the dwarves of Khazad-dûm made things they had never made before, things touched with an elvish refinement that their more purely technical tradition had not previously achieved. And the elves learned from the dwarves how to work certain materials, how to achieve certain effects of texture and strength that had been beyond them. The most famous result of the elven side of this collaboration was, of course, the Rings of Power. Celebrimbor and his craftsmen, drawing on the accumulated knowledge of this exchange, made the 3, the 7, and the 9, the rings that would shape the entire Second and Third Age of the world. The 3 were kept by the elves, who had made them alone, without Sauron's corrupting hand. The 7 were given to the dwarves, and the 9 went to men, 7 rings for the dwarven lords. This is significant beyond the immediate political implications. The giving of the 7 was an acknowledgement of the dwarves' position as one of the 3 great races of Middle-earth, alongside elves and men, who deserved to share in the new dispensation of power that the rings were meant to create. The 7 dwarven ring-bearers were presumably the leaders of the 7 kindreds, or at least 7 of the most prominent dwarven lords of that age. And the rings did have an effect, but not the effect Sauron had intended when he made the one ring to rule them all. The corruption of the rings of power worked differently on dwarves than it did on men. This is one of the most interesting and revealing details of dwarven nature in all the lore. Men bearing the 9 had become wraiths, The Nazgûl, the ring-wraiths, those terrible undead servants whose own wills had been utterly consumed by Sauron's power. But the dwarves, bearing the Seven, could not be made into wraiths. Sauron had hoped to dominate them through the rings, to bend their purposes to his will, to turn them into another set of servants. It did not work. The dwarves were too hard, too stubborn, too deeply set in their own purposes, precisely those qualities that Ilúvatar had warned of when Aulë first made them. Their wills could not be broken the way men's wills could be broken. The rings slid off their characters the way rain slides off well-worked stone. What the Seven did do was amplify the dwarves' natural inclinations. They made the dwarves more what they already were, more acquisitive, more focused on treasure, more driven to accumulate wealth. Each of the 7 dwarven ring-bearers became enormously wealthy, richer than any dwarf had ever been before, masters of treasure hoards that astonished even their own people. But this amplification of existing tendencies also carried its own danger, a danger that Sauron had perhaps foreseen, even if he could not achieve direct domination. The hoarding instinct, the passion for gold and gems, the obsessive acquisitiveness, these things, amplified past a natural limit, could destroy a dwarf as surely as any wraith magic. They could drive a king to paranoia, to cruelty, to the kind of draconian hoarding that drove away friends and drew in enemies. And some of those enemies were dragons. But before we get to dragons, which is very much ahead in the story, let us return to the Second Age and the cataclysm that struck Eregion. Sauron, having failed to dominate the dwarves through the Seven, and having been revealed to the elves as a deceiver when he put on the One Ring and they felt his dominating will, turned to war. He attacked Eregion with great force around the year 1700 of the Second Age, and the destruction was complete. Celebrimbor was killed, the smithcraft of Eregion was scattered, the great community of craftsmen that had flourished on the doorstep of Khazad-dûm was wiped out, and Sauron, fresh from this victory, turned toward Khazad-dûm itself. He tried to break into the Dwarven kingdom, to seize its wealth and its mithril, perhaps to punish Durin's folk for their resistance to his ring manipulation. He failed. The gates of Khazad-dûm were shut against him, and behind those gates the dwarves withdrew into their mountain and refused to come out. They closed themselves in, sealed the great western doors, and waited. Sauron could not break into Khazad-dûm by force. The mountain was too strong, the defenses too deep, the dwarves too stubborn. He moved on, turning his attention to other conquests, and eventually the long wars of the Second Age, including the great conflict with the Númenóreans and the drowning of Númenor in the Akallabeth, unfolded across the world. Sauron was himself brought low at the end of the Second Age, in the War of the Last Alliance, when elves and men combined their forces, besieged Barad-dûr, and Isildur cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand. But Khazad-dûm had survived. Khazad-dûm was intact, its walls unbroken, its halls still full of dwarves and firelight and the endless labor of the forge. It had outlasted the wars of the Second Age, had outlasted Sauron's first great surge of power, had outlasted the fall of Eregion and the destruction of the high elven kingdoms. The mountain endured, Durin's folk endured, and the Third Age began. Breathe softly now, dear listener. We have come a long way, and there is still a long way to go, but you are doing beautifully. Let the weight of history settle over you gently, like a blanket of stone dust and forge smoke. You do not need to remember every name or every date. Simply let the shape of the story wash through you, the building, the flourishing, the endurance, and then, slowly, inevitably, the shadow. The opening centuries of the Third Age were, for Khazad-dûm, another period of prosperity. The mithril veins were still producing, though the dwarves had to dig ever deeper to reach them. The halls were still rich, still busy, still full of the sound of hammers and the smell of hot metal. The line of Durin continued. We are now, by this point, into the territory of the later Durins, the fourth or fifth reincarnations of that original spirit. Khazad-dûm was home to thousands of dwarves, perhaps tens of thousands, a city that had been growing and deepening for thousands of years. But there was something in the deep places. The miners who worked the lowest levels, the levels closest to the roots of the mountain where the oldest and richest mithril was found, had been noticing things. Strange sounds, perhaps, the feeling of being watched, a warmth in certain passages that could not be explained by proximity to the forge fires above. We do not know exactly when the first signs appeared, because the dwarven records of this period are fragmentary, and the outside world knew nothing of what was happening inside the mountain. But we do know, from what came later, that the digging went too deep. The Balrog of Morgoth, a Maya, a being of the same spiritual order as Sauron and the Astari wizards, but given over entirely to destruction and fire and shadow, had been hiding in the deepest roots of the mountain since the end of the First Age. When Morgoth had been defeated and his stronghold of Angband destroyed, this creature, this fire demon, had fled, diving into the earth, burrowing into the deepest parts of the world to escape the wrath of the Valar. And there it had lain, in the uttermost dark, in the deep places beneath Khazad-dûm, sleeping perhaps, or simply enduring in the way that ancient evil endures for thousands of years. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm did not know it was there. How could they? They were miners, they were craftsmen, they were digging for mithril, in the only direction the mithril still ran. Down, always down, following the vein ever deeper, driven partly by need. The upper levels were already exhausted, and partly by that characteristic dwarven stubbornness, that refusal to stop, that insistence on going further and finding more. And in the year 1980 of the Third Age, the miners broke through into something they had not expected. A chamber perhaps, or a deep fissure, or simply a level of rock that opened into the domain of the thing that slept below. We do not have a detailed account of what happened. What we know is that the Balrog was awakened, and once awakened it was unstoppable. The creature that the dwarves called Durin's Bane, because the king of Khazad-dûm at that time was Durin the Sixth, perhaps the sixth reincarnation of the founding father, came up from the deep places, and it killed the king. It killed Durin the Sixth and his son Ninwai after him, and it drove the dwarves out. Not in a single day, not in a single battle, but in a campaign of horror that made Khazad-dûm uninhabitable. The creature did not need to kill every single dwarf. It simply needed to make the mountains so terrifying, so saturated with death and darkness, that staying became impossible, and it succeeded. By the year 1981 of the Third Age, within a single generation, the dwarves had abandoned Khazad-dûm. They poured out of the eastern and western gates, streaming into the world above, leaving behind everything they could not carry: the halls, the treasures, the mithril stores, the elaborate architecture of 1,000 years. They left it all, and they fled, and the creature remained. It settled into the deep places of the mountain, spreading its shadow through the empty halls, and the place that had been the greatest city in the world became Moria, the Black Pit. That is what the name means. The dwarves themselves gave it that name in their grief after the fall. The place of dread, the place of shadow. This is one of the great tragedies of Middle-earth, and it deserves to be felt for a moment, dear traveler. Imagine the weight of that loss. Not just a city, not just a treasury, not just a political center, but the foundational place of an entire civilization, the home of homes, the place where Durin himself had first opened his eyes and begun to build, the place where the mithril ran, the place that had been continuously inhabited, continuously alive, continuously growing for thousands and thousands of years, abandoned, left to darkness and fire. The surviving dwarves of Khazad-dûm scattered in various directions. Some went to the Iron Hills in the northeast, where other settlements of Durin's folk had existed. Some went south. Some tried to establish themselves in other parts of the Misty Mountains, in smaller halls and lesser cities, trying to rebuild something of what they had lost. None of these attempts fully succeeded. Nothing could replace Khazad-dûm, and the loss of it hung over Durin's folk like a shadow that never quite lifted. In the years and centuries that followed the abandonment of Khazad-dûm, the story of the dwarves became a story of diaspora, of a people dispersed across a wide landscape, clinging to identity and tradition in circumstances that made both increasingly difficult to maintain. This is, in many ways, the central drama of dwarven civilization in the Third Age. Not conquest, not expansion, but survival. The attempt to hold together a culture and a sense of purpose after the loss of the thing that had given that culture its center. Some of Durin's folk, in the centuries after the abandonment, found their way to a place called Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. This great volcanic peak stood alone in the northeastern landscape, a mountain without a range, isolated in the wide flatlands east of Mirkwood. It was far from the misty mountains, far from the ancestral homeland, but it had what the dwarves needed: rich mineral deposits, defensible stone walls, enough space to build. The dwarves who settled it in the early Third Age found it good, and over the generations they transformed it in the way they always transformed mountains, by going inside them. Erebor developed in the centuries after its initial settlement into a great kingdom in its own right, not as large as Khazad-dûm had been, not as deep, not as old, but wealthy, architecturally impressive, and alive with the energy of a people who were trying to rebuild what they had lost. The kings of Erebor maintained the line of Durin, and their capital beneath the mountain became famous throughout the north for the quality of its work and the scale of its wealth. The great treasuries of Erebor, filled over generations with the products of the mines and the forge, became legendary. The diamond waistcoat, the gem called the Arkenstone. These were treasures of Erebor, produced by the particular craft of that particular place in that particular time. There was also a settled community of men nearby. Dale, the city of men, built at the feet of the Lonely Mountain, which grew prosperous through its trade with the dwarves. The relationship between Erebor and Dale was, in this period, one of the more functional relationships between dwarves and men in Middle-earth, mutually beneficial, based on commerce and the complementary needs of two peoples who happened to be neighbors. The men of Dale had agricultural surplus and access to the outside world's trade routes. The dwarves had manufactured goods of unsurpassed quality and the wealth of the mountain's mines. They needed each other, and for a long time that need kept the peace. But elsewhere, in that same Third Age, the other kindreds of dwarves were suffering. The 7 rings that had been given to the dwarven lords had not produced the domination Sauron intended, but they had produced their own form of damage. The ring-amplified hunger for gold had led several of the dwarven ring-bearers into conflicts with dragons, those great serpents of fire and destruction, whose own greed for treasure was well matched against the dwarves' obsession with accumulating it. 3 of the 7 dwarven rings were destroyed by dragonfire. 3 more were eventually reclaimed by Sauron. Only 1 survived into the late Third Age, and the dragons took more than rings. They took cities. They took whole kingdoms. The history of the dwarven kindreds outside of Durin's folk in the Third Age is largely a history of losses: cities taken by dragons, mines overrun, populations scattered. By the time we reach the events of the late Third Age, the period of the great stories, several of the original 7 kindreds have been reduced to shadows of their former selves. The Iron Fists, the Stiff Beards, the Blacklocks, the Stonefoots, names in the records, their current whereabouts and conditions in the time of the War of the Ring, largely unknown even to their neighbors. But it was not only dragons that struck Durin's folk. There were other enemies, other disasters, and chief among them was the War of the Dwarves and the Orcs, one of the most destructive and consequential wars in the Third Age history of Middle-earth, a conflict that is often overlooked in favor of the larger narrative arcs of elves and men and rings, but which shaped the dwarven world of the late Third Age as profoundly as any other event. It began with a skull. The story has its roots in an incident that occurred around the year 2790 of the Third Age. Thror, once the great king of Erebor, we will get to how he came to be displaced in a moment, had in his later years become a wanderer, reduced from a king to an exile, stripped of his mountain and his treasure. He was old and proud and perhaps not entirely in his right mind, and in his wanderings he made a fateful decision. He would return to Khazad-dûm. He would enter the ancient kingdom alone. He wanted to see the old halls one more time, perhaps to reclaim some sense of the greatness that had been lost. He walked in through the ancient gates into the darkness. He did not come out again, or rather, part of him came out. His companion Nar, who had waited outside, eventually received a body, Thror's body, killed and mutilated by the orcs who now inhabited Moria, under the leadership of their terrible chieftain Azog, and carved into the old king's forehead was a single word, the Orcish name for slave, an insult as deliberate and precise as a knife thrust. Na brought this news to Thrain, Thror's son, and the grief and rage that erupted from Thrain were uncontainable. He sent messengers to every dwarven hall, every dwarven settlement, every dwarven lord from the Iron Hills to the Blue Mountains, summoning the entire race to war. This was unprecedented in the Third Age. The seven kindreds, usually so separate, so protective of their independence, had not assembled in force since the days of the wars of Balrog. But the message was heard, and the dwarves came. From every corner of the world, the kindreds gathered. Iron Hills, Blue Mountains, the scattered halls of the Grey Mountains, the settlements of the East, they all sent warriors. The resulting army was enormous, the greatest concentration of dwarven military power since the First Age, and it marched on Moria with a simple, implacable purpose: to kill Azog and to cleanse Moria of its orc infestation, and to reclaim, if possible, the ancient homeland. The war lasted for 6 years, from 2793 to 2799. It was not a glorious war. It was grinding, brutal, fought mostly underground in the passages of Moria and in the valleys around it. The dwarves won almost every battle. They were not tactically subtle. They fought the way their race always fought, with stubborn, forward-pressing ferocity, their great axes rising and falling, their mail coats absorbing blow after blow, their formation tightening when it should have broken. But the orcs had the advantage of numbers and of knowing the terrain, and the losses on both sides were catastrophic. The climactic battle was the Battle of Azanul-Bizar, Nanduhirion in Elvish, the valley at the feet of the Misty Mountains, the same valley where Durin himself had first looked into the Mirror at the very beginning of the world. It was fought in 2799, and it was one of the bloodiest single battles in the history of Middle-earth. The dwarves drove the orcs out of Moria and through the valley to the very gates, and there the last great struggle took place. Azog was killed by Dain Ironfoot, a young dwarf from the Iron Hills who had not yet reached his full maturity. He killed Azog on the steps of the eastern gate of Moria, and in doing so he struck what the dwarves believed to be a decisive blow. But the victory had a terrible cost. Thrain's son Thorin, yes, the Thorin Oakenshield, the future hero of the great quest, fought in this battle as a young warrior. He fought so fiercely and with such conspicuous courage that he became famous that day. The name Oakenshield attached to him for how he had used an oak branch as a shield when his own was broken. But the army around him was broken by its victory. The losses were so terrible, the surviving warriors so exhausted and grief-stricken, that when Thrain suggested they now go inside and reclaim Moria itself, now that Azog was dead, Dain Ironfoot refused. He refused not out of cowardice. He refused because he had seen, standing at the eastern gate of Moria, something that stopped him. He had sensed or glimpsed the Balrog, Durin's bane, still inside the mountain, still present in the deep places, still as terrible as it had ever been. He told Thrain plainly, "I will not lead the living into that shadow. The gate of Khazad-dûm is still beyond our reach." And so the greatest dwarven army ever assembled in the Third Age turned away from the gates of their ancient home, carrying their dead on great pyres of wood, for there was not enough stone in that place to bury them all properly. And so the dwarven dead of Azanul-Bizar were burned, which was not the dwarven way, and was itself a kind of grief. The army dispersed. Dain Ironfoot went back to the Iron Hills. Others went to their own places, and Thrain and his son Thorin were left without a kingdom, without a home, diminished and wandering. They ended up in the Blue Mountains, in Ered Luin, those same ancient mountains where the Blue Mountain dwarves had lived in the First Age, now much reduced but still habitable. Thrain and Thorin established a community there, in the eastern arm of the Blue Mountains, and lived as best they could, mining, crafting, trading. But it was a diminished life for the descendants of Durin's line, a far cry from the glory of Erebor, or the ancient magnificence of Khazad-dûm, because Erebor had fallen too. This brings us back to that story which I set aside a moment ago. The fall of Erebor had happened just before the war of dwarves and orcs in the year 2770 of the Third Age, and it had come in the form of a dragon, Smaug. The name is one of the most famous in all of Tolkien's legendarium, and rightly so. Smaug the Golden, the greatest dragon of the Third Age, a creature of immense size and cunning, armored in scales like a shirt of golden mail, his belly crusted with gems and gold from the treasure hoard he had already accumulated before he arrived at Erebor. He had smelled the treasure. That was the simple, terrible truth of it. A dragon had caught the scent of Erebor's wealth on the wind, had flown in from the north, and had descended on the lonely mountain with a fury that nothing in the north could stop. The dwarves fought. Of course they fought. They always fought. But a dragon is not an orc or a goblin or a man-at-arms. A dragon is a catastrophe made flesh, a natural disaster with intelligence and malice, whose fire could melt stone, and whose scale could turn any blade the dwarves possessed. The battle was over quickly. The people of Dale were caught in the initial assault, and their city was burned. The dwarves who could flee fled. King Thror escaped with a small company, including his son Thrain and his grandson Thorin, who was still a child. They poured out of the secret side door in the mountain, a door too small for Smaug to fit through, and stumbled into the world outside. Refugees, dispossessed, the line of Durin, without a kingdom for the second time in their history, and Smaug settled into Erebor, into the great halls and the deep treasuries, and lay down on the gold. For 60 years he lay there, simply lay on the treasure, and breathed the hot, stale air of the mountain, and dreamed, if dragons dream, whatever dragons dream about. He killed the animals in the surrounding countryside. He occasionally burned things for his own pleasure or from boredom. He made no effort to expand his territory, to conquer anything, to do anything at all except possess the gold. The most dangerous and destructive thing about Smaug for most of those 60 years was simply his existence. The fact that he was there and the treasure was his, and no one could take it from him. Thrain, in his wandering exile, had never stopped thinking about the mountain. He had the last of the 7 dwarven rings, the one that had come down through the line of Durin, and its influence fed the obsession that was already naturally his. The longing for the mountain, for the gold, for the Arkenstone, for the symbol of everything the line of Durin had been and done and built. In 2841, unable to bear the loss any longer, he set out, old and alone, or nearly alone, to try to find a way back to Erebor. It was not a rational plan. It was an act of grief driven to madness. He never made it. Sauron's agents found him in Mirkwood, captured him, brought him to the dungeons of Dol Guldur, that dark tower in the forest where Sauron, who had been lurking under the name of the Necromancer, maintained his growing power. In Dol Guldur, the last dwarven ring was taken from Thrain. He was held there for years, his mind slowly breaking, until a wandering wizard named Gandalf found him, more dead than alive, and received from him, in a moment of lucidity that would not come again, a small key and a piece of parchment with a map of the lonely mountain and a few words about doors and keys and stars, and the beginning of a plan. Thrain died in Dol Guldur. The last ring of the dwarves was gone. The great king of Erebor, the rightful ruler of the lonely mountain, ended his days in a dungeon, his mind shattered, his people scattered, his kingdom occupied by a dragon. We breathe slowly now, dear listener. There is a kind of accumulated grief to this part of the story. The long descent, the losses stacking up, the sense of a great civilization shrinking year by year, king by king, treasure hoard by treasure hoard. It is the nature of all long stories that they pass through dark passages, and the dwarves were in a very dark passage indeed in the years leading up to the year 2941 of the Third Age. That year, that particular year, this is where the story turns. Thorin Oakenshield, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain in name, if not yet in fact. He was, by 2941, an old dwarf by human reckoning, but not yet ancient by dwarven standards. He had been born in 2746, which made him nearly 200 years old, a respectable age for a dwarf, but not yet approaching the oldest reaches of dwarven longevity. He was a formidable figure, broad-shouldered, dark-haired with silver in it, with the long beard of a dwarven lord, with the bearing of someone who had been raised to kingship and had never quite reconciled himself to the fact that the kingdom was gone. He had his pride, great pride, the pride of Durin's line, which could be magnificent and could be its own form of tragedy. He had spent years in the Blue Mountains, working, building, trading, keeping his people together through sheer force of will, but he had never stopped wanting Erebor back. In the spring of 2941, Gandalf the Grey arrived at the door of a small hole in Bag End in the Shire and knocked on it, and started a chain of events that would restore the mountain to Durin's folk. This is not the place to retell the whole of the quest of Erebor. It is its own vast, detailed, beloved story, but it is essential to the history of the dwarves and must be honored in its proper place. What Gandalf had done in the months before that knock on the hobbit's door was gather together 13 dwarves, 13 members of Durin's folk, and convince them that the time had come to take back Erebor. He had also, crucially, secured the map and the key that Thrain had given him in Dol Guldur, and he had selected, for reasons of his own, that the dwarves did not fully understand, a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins as the company's burglar. The company was Thorin Oakenshield as their leader, then Fili and Kylie, his nephews, young by dwarven standards, the sons of his sister Dís, then Dwalin, one of the oldest and most formidable warriors in the company, whose great tattooed head and heavy axes were a constant reassurance of physical capability. Balin, his brother, older, gentler, more reflective, a dwarf who kept records and thought about history. Oin and Gloin brothers, with Gloin being the more voluble and the more easily offended of the two. Dori, Nori, and Ori, 3 brothers, very different from one another, with Ori being the young scribe of the company, the one who kept notes, whose handwriting we will see again in a most terrible context. Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur, 3 more kinsmen, with Bombur being memorably round and memorably fond of sleep. 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit, a small company to take back a mountain defended by a dragon. But Gandalf had his reasons, and the quest went forward. I will not trace every step of the quest in detail. The trolls in the Troll Shores, the stay with Elrond in Rivendell, the encounter with the stone giants in the Misty Mountains, the goblin tunnels, Gollum and the Ring, the eagles, Beorn's house, the long transit through Mirkwood, the imprisonment in the Elven King's halls, the escape in barrels down the Forest River. These are the events of The Hobbit, and they belong to their own telling. But a few moments deserve particular attention in the context of dwarven history. The first is the discovery of the secret door. After all the journeying, after all the dangers, the company arrived at the feet of Erebor, or rather at the western slopes, the quieter side of the lonely mountain that faced away from the ruins of Dale and the greater world. They found the passage described on Thror's map, found the door at the end of it, waited for the moon to illuminate the runes that told them how to open it. Thorin's key fit the lock. The door opened, and after 60 years, the line of Durin stood at the threshold of their ancestral home. The second is Thorin's response to the treasure. When Bilbo brought back the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, the great white gem that had been the symbol of the kingship of Erebor, something happened to Thorin that was familiar and terrible: the dragon sickness. The ring amplified desire for gold, the possessive madness that dragons seemed to catalyze in those who had long been deprived of their treasure settled over him like a fog. He became suspicious, aggressive, irrational. He refused to honor the agreements he had made with the men of Laketown, who had helped the company and whose own town had been destroyed by Smaug when the dragon, awakened by Bilbo's intrusion, had flown south in rage and burned everything before dying. Thorin barricaded himself in the mountain and threatened war. This episode, the Siege of Erebor, the approaching confrontation between Thorin and the combined forces of Bard of Dale and the Elves of Mirkwood, is one of the most uncomfortable episodes in Tolkien's writing, because the hero, such as he is, has become the problem. Thorin Oakenshield, who has spent the entire story as the determined, proud, suffering king in exile, trying to reclaim what was rightfully his, has been transformed by the dragon sickness into an obstacle to peace, a miser in a mountain, a figure more pitiable than admirable. The ring-gold corruption has done to him what it could not do through simple domination by working on what was already in him: the love of gold, the sense of wrong, the need to possess and hold and not share. It was Bilbo who tried to break the deadlock, giving the Arkenstone to Bard and the Elven King as a bargaining chip, hoping that Thorin's desire for the jewel would be enough to make him negotiate. Thorin's response when he found out was to renounce Bilbo utterly, to cast him from the company, to call him a traitor, and perhaps, in that moment, you could see in Thorin everything that was both great and terrible about the dwarves: the pride, the stubbornness, the capacity for magnificent achievement, and the equally magnificent capacity for self-destructive inflexibility. But the Battle of Five Armies intervened before the conflict between men, elves and dwarves could become a war. Out of the north came the orcs of Gundabad and the Misty Mountains, a great army of them marching south to take advantage of the confusion around Erebor and claim the mountain and its treasure for themselves. And in the face of that common enemy, the three free peoples turned from their quarrel to fight together. The Battle of Five Armies was fought on and around the lonely mountain, men, elves and dwarves against orcs and wargs, with the eagles of the Misty Mountains arriving at a crucial moment to turn the tide, and Bjorn in his great bear form descending into the thick of the battle like a force of nature. The orcs were defeated. Azog's son, Bolg, who had led them, was killed. The threat was ended, but Thorin was dying. He had gone into the battle transformed, the dragon sickness, broken perhaps, by the simplicity of having a real enemy to fight, of having other people to protect, of being needed in a way that did not involve simply possessing gold. He fought with extraordinary valor, breaking out of the mountain at the head of his dwarven company at the most critical moment, buying time for the eagles to arrive, and in doing so, he received wounds that could not be healed. Bilbo was brought to him as he lay dying, and what passed between them was one of the most quietly moving moments in all of Tolkien's writing. Thorin apologized. He withdrew the words he had spoken in anger. He acknowledged that the world would be a merrier place if more people valued good food and good cheer and the music of a fire above gold. He sent his friend away with genuine love, with the shadow of the sickness lifted, and died at peace. He was buried beneath the mountain, beneath Erebor, with the Arkenstone upon his breast. His nephews, Fili and Kili, had also died in the battle, fighting to protect their uncle. 3 members of the royal line of Durin gone in a single day. The eldest of the remaining dwarves, Dain Ironfoot from the Iron Hills, the same Dain who had killed Azog at the end of the War of Dwarves and Orcs, and who had refused to enter Moria, was acclaimed king under the mountain. Rest here for a moment, dear traveler. Breathe slowly. The Battle of Five Armies is past. The mountain is retaken. There is grief in it. There is always grief in victory that cost this much, but there is also restoration. The line of Durin is maintained. The kingdom of Erebor is alive. The city of Dale is rebuilt under Bard, who becomes its first king. Trade between dwarves and men resumes. For a few generations, perhaps the last few generations of the Third Age's relative stability, things are good in the north. Dain Ironfoot was, in many ways, the ideal dwarven king for a time of reconstruction. He was practical, less haunted by the past than Thorin had been, with fewer of the burdens of the line of Durin's particular psychology. He was a warrior without any illusions about what war cost, and he had enough wisdom to apply that understanding to statecraft. Under his rule, Erebor was restored and expanded, its forges lit again, its miners sent back into the mountain's depths, its treasuries once more filling with the products of dwarven craft. Dale, rebuilt by Bard and his successors, became again the prosperous trading city it had been before Smaug. The relationship between the two peoples resumed, and it was a good relationship. Genuinely cooperative, genuinely mutually beneficial, built on the foundation of a shared enemy defeated and a shared future to build. But now let us step back from Erebor and return to the other great thread of the late Third Age for Durin's folk, the story that had been developing in parallel, the story of Moria and of an attempt that would prove as heartbreaking in its end as anything that had come before. After the events of the quest of Erebor, with Erebor restored and Dain Ironfoot secure on the throne, some of Durin's folk began to dream of a second restoration, the restoration of the original home, the ancient glory, the halls of Khazad-dûm itself. Among those who dreamed this dream most fiercely was Balin, son of Fundin. You will remember Balin from the company of Thorin Oakenshield, the older, reflective one, the one who had been Bilbo's particular friend among the dwarves, the one who had wept when Thorin died. Balin was now a great lord of Durin's folk, respected and beloved, and the idea of reclaiming Moria had become his consuming passion. In the year 2989 of the Third Age, roughly 50 years after the quest of Erebor, Balin gathered a company of volunteers and marched east to attempt the retaking of Khazad-dûm. He took with him several hundred dwarves, a sizable force, equipped with everything Erebor could provide. Among the company were Oin, another veteran of the quest, and Ori, young Ori, the scribe, the note-taker, the one who kept records. Ori, who would write the words that Gandalf would one day read in the chamber of Mazarbul. At first, the attempt succeeded. The initial assault drove the orcs out of the upper levels. Balin himself killed a great orc in the pool at the threshold of Moria's eastern gate, the very pool that would one day try to seize the Fellowship of the Ring. They drove the orcs back, level by level, and established themselves in the upper halls. For a time, perhaps for 5 years, it seemed as though the impossible dream might be achieved. Balin was acclaimed Lord of Moria. He sat in the great hall and looked around at walls carved by hands that had been dust for thousands of years. And perhaps he felt something of what Durin himself must have felt, looking at the work of all those generations and knowing that it still stood. But the Balrog was still there, in the deepest places, in the roots of the mountain. The ancient thing that had driven the dwarves out 1,000 years ago was still there, still breathing its fire and shadow, still waiting. And there were orcs still in the middle levels, and the world was changing. Sauron's power in the east was growing again, and with it the boldness and the numbers of the orcs. By 2994, 5 years after the start of the colony, things were going badly. Balin was killed, shot by an orc arrow, at the very edge of the Mirrormere, in Azanul Bizarre, the valley where he had looked at his own reflection and seen the stars. His body was brought back inside the mountain and laid in a tomb in what the dwarves had established as the chamber of Mazarbul, a record room near the heart of their settlement. And Ori began writing the Book of Mazarbul, the record that Gandalf, decades later, would find and read aloud in that terrible room. It recorded the collapse, stage by stage. The first entries were hopeful. News from the east, the progress of the colony, Balin's achievements. Then the tone changes. The orcs are growing bolder. Supplies are running low. There have been losses. The lower passages are too dangerous. We cannot get out. The water is rising. We hear drums in the deep. We cannot get out. Oin tried to take a group and find another way out through the western gate. He was taken by the Watcher in the water, the tentacled creature in the pool before the west gate, and never seen again. The remaining dwarves, trapped in the upper levels with orcs pressing from below and above, made their last stand in the chamber of Mazarbul. The final entries in the book are written in a trembling hand, the letters forming with difficulty, the words sparse. They are coming. We cannot get out. That hand was Ori's, the scribe, the young one, the one who had kept notes all the way from the Shire to the Lonely Mountain and back. He died in the chamber of Mazarbul, and his record died with him, until Gandalf read it to the Fellowship 50 years later by torchlight, and the grief of it was fresh even then. The Balin expedition failed completely. Every member of it died, in one way or another, within the mountain or at its fringes. Moria was not reclaimed. The dream was was not achieved. Khazad-dûm remained what it had been since 1981, the Black Pit, the dwelling of fire and shadow, the greatest ruin of dwarven civilization and the most persistent wound in the dwarven soul. Be gentle with yourselves now, dear listener. These are heavy stories, even told softly. Let the weight of them sink down beneath you into the comfortable surface where you rest, and let your own body grow quieter and heavier in response. You are safe. The night is peaceful. These stories happened long ago in a world that only ever existed in the imagination of a man who loved it deeply, and they are beautiful even in their sadness, the way all deep things are beautiful when they are true to themselves. Now, while the colony of Balin was meeting its fate in the depths of Moria, the larger world of Middle-earth was moving toward its final crisis. The War of the Ring, the great conflict of the Third Age, the one that everything had been building toward, was approaching, and the dwarves would play their part in it. Glóin and Gimli, father and son, the former a veteran of the quest of Erebor, the latter born into the generation that came after, were sent from Erebor to Rivendell, the last homely house, as messengers. Sauron's emissary had come to Erebor demanding information about the ring and about Bilbo Baggins, and Dain Ironfoot had wisely refused to give anything away, while simultaneously sending word to Rivendell that such an approach had been made. At the Great Council in Rivendell, Elrond's council, where the fate of the ring was debated and the Fellowship was formed, Glóin gave his report, and Gimli, his son, was chosen as the dwarven member of the Fellowship. This choice, Gimli as the representative of his race in the 9-membered company that would bear the ring to Mordor, is significant beyond the merely practical. It placed a dwarf at the center of the war's most important action for the first time in Middle-earth history. The dwarves were not usually players in the grand political narratives of elves and men. They tended to focus on their own affairs, their own territories, their own quarrels. Gimli's inclusion in the Fellowship was unusual, almost anomalous, and it led to consequences that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. The first of those consequences was Moria. The Fellowship, unable to cross the misty mountains by the high pass of the Redhorn Gate, turned back by Caradhras in a blizzard that may or may not have been Sauron's doing, chose instead to go under the mountains, through Moria, through Khazad-dûm. Gimli wanted this. Of course he did. He was a dwarf of Durin's folk. The ancient halls of Khazad-dûm were the ancestral home of his people, and he had grown up hearing stories of their glory. He expected, perhaps, to find Balin's colony still in place, to meet his father's old companions and receive a dwarven welcome in the deep halls. He expected torches and feasting and the ring of hammers. What he found was bones. The Fellowship entered through the western gate, the Gate of the West, the ancient door inscribed with Celebrimbor's lettering in the script of the Noldor, visible only by starlight, and they entered into darkness. The corridors were empty, the forges were cold, the silence was so complete and so heavy that it pressed against the ears. And then they found the signs of battle, and the bones, and the tomb, and the book of Mazarbul. Gandalf read from the book, and they heard Ori's last words, and Gimli wept quietly. The grief was immediate and personal. These were not abstract historical dwarves, but his father's friends, people he had heard stories about, whose voices he perhaps could half remember from childhood. And then the orcs came, and the fight in the chamber of Mazarbul, and the retreat toward the bridge of Khazad-dûm, that thin arch of stone above the abyss, the last great architectural achievement of Moria's builders, still standing in the dark after all those empty years. And on the bridge, Gandalf turned and made his stand against the Balrog, against Durin's bane, against the fire demon that had killed Durin Sisix 1,000 years before, that had driven the dwarves from their home, that had slept in the deep places through all the intervening centuries and killed every attempt to return. You shall not pass, the words that everyone knows. The wizard, his staff, the thin bridge, the darkness below and above and on all sides, the creature of fire and shadow on the other side, and the bridge broke, and Gandalf fell, and the Balrog fell with him, both of them falling into the deep places, into the ancient abyss beneath the roots of the mountains. The Fellowship ran. They ran up the long stairways through the Hall of Pillars to the eastern gate, blinking and weeping in the sudden light of day, stumbling out onto the rocky slopes above Azanulbizar. Below them, faintly, they could see the Mirrormere, the still pool where Durin had first looked at his reflection, and seen the stars. Gimli looked at it and wept again. It was all still there, the valley, the lake, the reflected stars, just as it had been, when Durin himself had stood here at the very beginning of the world, before there was a city, before there was a civilization, before all the building and all the loss, the Mirror unchanged, the stars unchanged, and everything else, the city, the people, the purpose, gone. This is one of the great moments of the entire narrative, because it is both an ending and a question. What does it mean to lose a civilization and have only its reflection remain? What is preserved when the builders are gone and only the mirror still shows the stars? But the story does not end there. Of course it does not. Gimli, moving through the world in the Fellowship and then in the campaigns that followed, in Fangorn, in Helm's Deep, at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, at the Black Gate, became something no other dwarf in living memory had been. A dwarf who moved fully among the other races of Middle-earth, who made genuine friendships across the usual barriers, who was changed by what he encountered and helped to change it in turn. The friendship between Gimli and Legolas deserves particular attention because it is both improbable and profoundly significant. A dwarf and an elf, members of two races that had mistrusted and sometimes hated each other since the First Age, since the killing of Thingol, since all the old bitter grievances, becoming close friends, closer perhaps than any dwarf and elf had ever been. It began badly. The Fellowship's arrival in Lothlorien, the great elven forest ruled by Galadriel and Celeborn, required Gimli to submit to being blindfolded, which he considered an insult. He was angry, and Legolas was impatient, and the friction between them was real. But Lothlorien worked on Gimli in an unexpected way. He entered the Golden Forest expecting nothing but an uncomfortable stay among people who did not trust him, and he came out changed. Galadriel, the great elven queen, spoke to him in Khazad-dûm, or so it seemed to him, though she was likely speaking to his mind directly, and the effect was transformative. He offered her a gift he had never offered anyone, a piece of his inmost self, his pure appreciation, his recognition of beauty for its own sake, and she gave him what he asked for, 3 strands of her hair, and Gimli received them as the greatest treasure he had ever possessed. Not gold, not mithril, not any of the physical wealth that his people had spent their whole civilization chasing. Hair, the freely given gift of a person he admired. He became, in the months that followed, a dwarf unlike any other in the record. He walked through the world of elves and men and hobbits, with an openness that his people rarely permitted themselves, and he was enriched by it. His friendship with Legolas deepened into something that neither of them fully had words for, a genuine intimacy, a partnership of complementary strengths, a mutual acknowledgement of what the other was in their fullest and best expression. The dwarf who loved stone and the elf who loved trees, finding in each other a strange completeness. At Helm's Deep, in the great battle of the Hornburg, Gimli fought with a ferocity that became legendary. He and Legolas kept a running count of orcs killed, a grim joke that was also a genuine expression of their competitive friendship, the game of it carrying them both through the terror of the battle. 42, said Legolas. He had 42 kills. And Gimli? He had 43. He won by a single kill. He won, and even in the middle of one of the most desperate battles of the Third Age, even surrounded by the dead and the dying, and the smoke of burning, there was something almost like joy in that small victory, that absurd competition between friends. He was present at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, where the armies of Mordor assaulted Minas Tirith and were broken by the coming of Rohan and by Aragorn's arrival with the dead. He stood at the Black Gate in the final, desperate gambit that was meant to draw Sauron's attention away from Frodo and Sam, struggling toward Mount Doom. He was there when the ring was unmade in the fires of Orodruin, when Sauron's power was finally permanently broken, when the Third Age ended and the Fourth began. And in the Fourth Age, Gimli, son of Glóin, did something that had never been done before and would never be done again, something so improbable that it seems almost like a deliberate statement about possibility. about what could happen when the old barriers were lowered and the old wounds were allowed to heal, he went to the glittering caves. The glittering caves of Aglarond lay behind Helm's Deep, behind the great wall of the Hornburg, carved by water over ages into a system of crystalline chambers of extraordinary beauty. He had glimpsed them during the Battle of Helm's Deep, moving through the caves to escape the orc assault, and what he had seen had struck him like a hammer blow. Beauty of a kind he had never imagined, a natural architecture of stone and crystal that surpassed anything any craftsman had ever made, a gift of the earth itself rather than of hands. He had spoken about it afterward to Legolas with an intensity that surprised even himself, reaching for words adequate to what he had seen and finding them inadequate, stumbling over the vocabulary of mineral and light. After the war, when the rebuilding began, Gimli returned to those caves. He became their lord, the lord of the glittering caves of Aglarond, and he brought with him a colony of dwarves, craftsmen, and miners and architects, and they built, not into the caves, he was very clear on this, very protective of what the water and the time had already made, but alongside them, around them, using the caves as the center of a new dwarven settlement in the south, in the heartland of men's territory, in a place where no dwarves had ever built before. It was a new thing, a new kind of dwarven civilization, more open than the old, located in a part of the world that was connected to men and to the affairs of the wider realm in a way that the old mountain fortresses had not been. Gimli used the skills of his people, unequaled in stonework, unequaled in underground architecture, in service of the kingdom of men as well as of his own. The great gates of Minas Tirith, destroyed by the Witch King's ram in the battle for the city, were remade by Gimli and his dwarves in mithril and steel, a gift, a gesture of alliance, an expression of the new relationship between the kindreds. And Legolas, true to his friendship, came south from his northern home and brought elves to plant trees in Ithilien, across the river from Minas Tirith, and the two of them, the dwarf and the elf, made things in the same part of the world, in the same generation, in the same friendship that the world had not seen made together since the days of Eregion 3,000 years before. Meanwhile, back in the north, the victory of the War of the Ring had to be won by Erebor and Dale as well. For Sauron had not focused all his forces on the south. He had sent armies north as well, against the Iron Hills and the Lonely Mountain, because he knew that Dain Ironfoot of Erebor was an ally of the Free Peoples, and that the dwarves would fight if attacked. And fight they did, the Battle of Dale. In the very days when the Pelennor fields were burning far to the south, when Theoden of Rohan rode to his death against the armies of Mordor, when the city of Gondor was being besieged. In those same days, Dain Ironfoot and Brand, king of Dale, stood in battle outside the walls of Dale against a great Easterling army that had come at Sauron's command. Brand was killed. Dain Ironfoot was killed fighting over the body of his fallen ally, which is as dwarven a death as one could imagine, standing over a friend, refusing to yield, going down fighting. He was 153 years old, ancient even for a dwarf, and he died in battle as he had lived with an axe in his hand. The remaining forces of Dale and Erebor were pushed back into the mountain and besieged. Then the news came somehow through some swift channel. The ring was destroyed, Sauron was fallen, the armies of Mordor were everywhere collapsing and fleeing, and the dwarves and men who had been besieged in the mountain poured out, and the Easterling army that had pinned them there broke apart, and the battle in the north was won. Dain's son Thorin III, Stonehelm, became king under the mountain. Bran's son, Bard II, became king of Dale. The two peoples who had fought together in that northern battle entered the Fourth Age as allies, as they had been before, as perhaps their shared geography and their shared survival had made them destined to be. Khazad-dûm remained empty after the War of the Ring, after Sauron's fall, after the Balrog had been killed by Gandalf in their long struggle in the depths. For yes, they had fought each other through the heart of the mountain, up through the levels, up onto the peak of Zirak-Zigil itself, and there Gandalf the White had finally defeated the creature, the Balrog dying on the mountain's crown in a great last conflagration. After all of this, the ancient halls were empty of both menace and life. No dragon, no Balrog, no orc army, just empty stone and the echoes of history and the mithril veins, still potentially rich, still potentially there. Whether Durin's folk ever returned to reclaim Khazad-dûm in the Fourth Age is one of the open questions of Tolkien's world. One of those lovely uncertainties that the lore allows to hover in the air without resolution. There are hints, whispers really, that it was one of the great ambitions of the dwarves of the Fourth Age, that the empty halls of Moria were always on the edge of their consciousness, the way the empty throne is always on the edge of the consciousness of an exiled king. But the record does not clearly state that the return happened, at least not in the documents we have. What we do know is that the dwarves endured. That is, perhaps, the fundamental statement of their entire history. They endured. Everything else might be taken from them, their cities, their kings, their rings, their treasuries, their ancestral home. But the dwarves themselves could not be broken. They were made to last. They were made by a maker who loved them enough to weep when he thought he had to unmake them, to be as hard and as enduring as the stone they worked. 7 kindreds spread across the world, each suffering its own losses and disasters, but none of them completely gone. The line of Durin, interrupted and diminished, and grief-stricken and dragon-sick and dispossessed more times than any other line in Middle-earth's long history, still producing kings and heroes and craftsmen in each generation, still holding on to the memory of Khazad-dûm, still carrying the old dream forward. Let that image settle into you now, dear listener, the image of endurance, of something that cannot be broken because it was made from the beginning to be unbreakable. There is something restful in it, something deeply reassuring, not triumphant, not glorious in the way that Elvish history is glorious, but solid and warm in the way that a well-built hearth is solid and warm. The stones are still there. The halls are still there, empty but intact. The stars still reflect in the mirror as they have since the beginning. And somewhere in the east, the hammers are still ringing, the forges are still lit, and the dwarves are still at work. Now, I want to dwell more deeply, dear traveler, on the interior world of the dwarves, the social and cultural life, the values and the customs, and the particular character of a people who are so often portrayed as one-dimensional and reduced to their most visible surface qualities. Because the dwarves, in Tolkien's telling, are far more complex and far more interesting than the simple shorthand of greedy miners and stubborn warriors. Consider the question of how dwarves lived. Their great halls were not simply practical spaces for mining and metalwork. They were homes, genuine homes, with all the complexity and richness of domestic life that word implies. The dwarves lived in extended family groups, in clans and houses that mapped onto the kinship lines traced back to the 7 fathers. These family groups were intensely loyal to one another. This is the positive face of dwarven exclusivity, the warmth that lay behind the fortress wall. Within the community, among their own kin and their own people, the dwarves were generous, celebratory, devoted. They feasted together. They sang together. They kept long memories of their dead and honored them in the deep tombs that were cut into the rock beneath their halls. Dwarven music deserves particular attention. There is a tendency, I think, to overlook this aspect of their culture because the surface narrative of dwarven civilization is so dominated by craft and war. But the dwarves were genuine musicians, and their music reflected the qualities of their people in the most direct way. Deep voices, bass and baritone, filling the stone halls and setting the rock itself trembling faintly with the resonance. Their songs were long and often repetitive in the particular way of music that is meant to accompany work, the rhythmic pattern of hammer strikes, the steady drip of water cut into smaller segments by a regular beat. But they also had more elaborate compositions, songs that told the history of the kindreds in verse, that named the great deeds and the great losses, that carried the memory of the past forward into the present the way no written record quite can. Think of the dwarves in Bag End, in the opening of The Hobbit, when they take up their instruments and begin to play. Bilbo, listening from the hall, is surprised by the quality of their music, not what he expected from 13 dwarves who had just eaten everything in his larder and stacked his plates rather recklessly. The music goes from jolly to solemn, the voices deepening, the melody shifting into something ancient and aching and full of longing. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away, ere break of day, to seek our pale enchanted gold. There is in that song, that long, low, achingly beautiful song that Tolkien wrote for them, everything that is essential about the dwarves, the longing for home, the acceptance of hardship, the willingness to travel far and endure much for the sake of what is irreplaceable, the beauty that lives in the difficult and the deep. The dwarves were also story keepers. In addition to their official records, the chronicles and genealogies and accounts of battles that the scribes maintained in the record rooms, the dwarves kept their history alive in a more informal oral tradition, in the stories told around fires, and in the tales that grandparents told grandchildren, in the particular stories that each house considered its own and protected jealously. The story of the Arkenstone and what it meant for the line of Durin was one such story. The story of the Mirror, of Durin kneeling at the edge of the lake and seeing the stars above his own reflection, was another. The story of Aulë and the creation was another still, told differently in the dwarven version than in the elvish cosmological records, with different emphases, with the moment of Ilúvatar's grace given the weight and the centrality that it deserved. Their architecture, as we have discussed, was their most visible and most monumental form of cultural expression. But it is worth noting that dwarven architecture was not only about scale, not only about the vast halls and the deep levels and the impressive engineering. There was also a tradition of smaller-scale decorative work, of the kind of carving and inlay that requires sustained attention and fine skill rather than the sheer physical labor of cutting great chambers from rock. The knotwork patterns that decorated the walls and pillars of their halls, the angular runes that marked significant passages and doors, the small decorative elements that appeared on everyday objects, all of this spoke of a people who found beauty not only in the grand and the overwhelming, but also in the intricate and the precise. The dwarves' relationship with gems is worth a moment's reflection, separate from their relationship with gold. Gold was the symbol of wealth, the measure of prosperity, the thing that accumulated in treasuries and that the dragon sickness fixed on. But gems were something else. Gems were beautiful in themselves, in a way that dwarves seem to have valued for reasons that went beyond mere monetary worth. Cutting and polishing gems was a high craft, one of the highest, and the master gem cutters of Khazad-dûm and later of Erebor were celebrated figures within their communities. The gems they produced, shaped and polished and set in metalwork of extraordinary delicacy, were works of art in the fullest sense, objects that told stories in their facets, that caught and transformed light in ways that their creators had designed with as much intentionality as any painter or sculptor. The Arkenstone was the supreme example of this tradition. It was described as a globe of white fire, a jewel of the mountain's heart, found in the roots of the mountain and worked by the hands of the dwarves of Erebor into its final form of almost unbearable brightness. It was not made by magic, in the sense that elven craft was sometimes magic. It was made by the deep knowledge of stone and light that the best dwarven craftsmen possessed, combined with a piece of raw material that the mountain itself had offered. The Arkenstone was, in a sense, the distillation of everything that Erebor was, the mountain's gift to its inhabitants, worked by those inhabitants' hands into the form that best expressed both the giver and the receivers. The dwarves also had a complicated and fascinating relationship with death and burial that reflects many of their deepest values. Unlike men who generally buried their dead in the earth, the natural element, the returning to the substance from which they came, the dwarves buried their dead in stone, in tombs cut from the rock, in deep chambers that were themselves works of craft, inscribed with records of the deceased's life and lineage in the Kurth script. The angular runes developed specifically for carving in stone. These tombs were made to last as long as the mountain itself. The dwarves believed that their dead deserved enduring commemoration, and they built their memorials accordingly. The tomb of Thorin Oakenshield in Erebor, with the Arkenstone on his breast, and Orcrist, the elvish blade he had carried on the quest, laid beside him, is described in terms that make it clearly a place of genuine honor and beauty, not merely a hole in the rock. It was made to be visited, to be contemplated, to serve as a physical anchor for the memory of the king and everything he had been and done. The dwarves' relationship with gender is one of the most intriguing aspects of their social life and one of the most often misunderstood. The lore tells us that dwarven women were few, perhaps no more than a third of the total dwarven population, and that they rarely left the dwarven halls, rarely appeared in the public-facing dealings with other races that form the bulk of the historical record. This is why, when outsiders encountered dwarves, they almost always encountered only men, and this in turn gave rise to the joke, or the genuine misapprehension, that dwarven women did not exist, that dwarves sprang from stone. But within the halls, the women were fully present and fully valued. They shared the same qualities as the men of their race: the sturdiness, the stubbornness, the fierce pride, the depth of feeling. They were craftspeople as often as not miners typically, but smiths and weavers and gem cutters working in the interior spaces of the great halls. They were mothers, but in a specific dwarven sense. They chose their partners carefully and freely, and once they had made that choice, they did not typically make another. The capacity for exclusive devotion, the same stubbornness of attachment that characterized dwarven loyalty to kin and clan, was present in their personal relationships as well. There are accounts of dwarven women who refused to marry the partners their families had arranged for them, who remained single all their lives rather than accept a match they did not choose, and who were respected for this rather than censured. The dwarves, for all their communal loyalty and their fierce clan allegiance, recognized the interior sovereignty of the individual in the matter of love, and they honored it. Dís, sister of Thorin Oakenshield and mother of Fili and Kili, is the only named dwarven woman in the entire text of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Just one named woman in a civilization of thousands. This tells us more about the nature of the historical record, which was largely compiled by and for the male adventurers who dealt with other races, than it does about the actual role of women in dwarven society. Dís herself, though we hear very little about her, is presented as significant. The mother of two heroes, the surviving member of Thorin's immediate family, the one who would have received the news of her son's deaths at the Battle of Five Armies. The grief of that would have been, by dwarven reckoning, enormous. The capacity for deep attachment that characterized her people turning inward in loss. The dwarves' longevity, their natural lifespan of 200 to 300 years, shaped their civilization in ways that are easy to overlook. Think about what it means to live that long. You remember, personally and directly, events that happened a century ago. You knew the grandparents of the people around you. The historical record is not an abstraction for you. It is people you spoke to, halls you walked in, battles you survived. The weight of history is different when the living memory of it stretches back further than the farthest reach of any human lifetime. This gave the dwarves a particular quality of temporal depth, a sense that the past was not really past at all, but present, layered beneath the current moment the way geological strata are layered beneath the mountain. When Thorin spoke of Erebor, he was not speaking of something he had only read about or heard stories of. He had lived there. He had walked those halls as a child, had heard the forge fires, had smelled the mountain's particular smell of hot metal and deep stone. The loss was personal. The motivation for the quest was personal in a way that it could not have been for a shorter-lived race. This temporal depth also contributed to the famous dwarven stubbornness. When a people remembers injustices across multiple generations, not through inherited stories but through direct testimony, through the accounts of those who were actually there, the sense of grievance stays sharper, more immediate, more motivating than it would in a people who had to rely on records and traditions. The dwarves did not forgive easily because they did not forget easily. They could hold a grudge across centuries, and they could hold a loyalty across centuries as well, with equal tenacity. There is also the question of what the dwarves believed about their own fate after death. The theological dimension of their existence, which Tolkien addresses in ways that are both illuminating and deliberately left somewhat open. The elves in Tolkien's mythology were immortal. Their spirits, when their bodies died, went to the halls of Mandos in Valinor, and eventually, if Manwë decreed it, were re-embodied on the same world. Their fate was tied to Arda, to the physical earth, permanently. Men had a different gift and a different fate. Their spirits left the world entirely at death, passing to a destination that no one, not even the Valar, could see or know. It was called the gift of Ilúvatar, this departure, though it was also called the doom of men, depending on how you looked at it. And the dwarves, their fate was their own, different from both. Aulë had asked Ilúvatar for his people to have a part in the world, and Ilúvatar had granted it, but on specific terms. The dwarves were said to believe, in their own tradition, that Aulë maintained a hall for them after death, that the spirits of the dwarven dead went to a place prepared by their maker, and that they would sleep there in a kind of waiting until the end of the world, when Aulë would bring them forth again and they would help him in the final remaking of Arda. They believed that they had a role in the eschatology of the world, in its ultimate renovation, that their maker had specifically requested their labor for that final project, and that Ilúvatar had agreed. This belief gave the dwarves something that neither elves nor men quite had in the same form, a sense of ultimate cosmic purpose, of having been made for a specific role in the final act of the world's drama. Their stubbornness, their endurance, their refusal to stay down when beaten, all of it had, in this theology, a dimension beyond mere pride or genetic character. They were enduring because they had something to endure for. They were holding on because they were needed for what came after. Whether this belief was literally true in the theology of Tolkien's world, whether Aulë really does maintain a hall for his dwarves, whether they really will help in the remaking of Arda, the lore does not definitively say. But the belief itself is significant, and the quality of character that it describes and reinforces is absolutely real. The dwarves, of all the races of Middle-earth, are the most completely themselves, even in darkness, even in loss, even in disaster. They do not dissolve, they do not disperse, they hold. Now let us think about what it means that the dwarves were, in some theological sense, unauthorized, that Aulë made them without Ilúvatar's permission, and that Ilúvatar chose to grant them life anyway, out of what seems to be a response to genuine love rather than mere disobedience. There is something in this origin story that sets the dwarves apart from all the other races of Middle-earth in a specific and interesting way. They were not originally intended. They were not part of the plan, not sung into being in the great music that preceded creation. They are, in a sense, an addition to the world, an extra element that was not in the original design. And yet Ilúvatar says, after giving them life, that this was not entirely contrary to his will, that Aulë's longing, being itself a product of the nature that Ilúvatar had given him, could not produce anything entirely alien to the music, even if it had not been specifically planned within it. The dwarves fit into the world, even though they were not foreseen for it. They fill a place that was, perhaps, waiting to be filled. They love what Aulë loves, stone and craft and the physical substance of the world. And in doing so, they complement the other races, whose loves are different, whose roles in the world's unfolding are different. There is also a resonance between Aulë's unauthorized creation and Fëanor's Silmarils, and between both of these and Sauron's One Ring. All three are cases of a maker putting too much of himself into his creation, of love for the work spilling over into something possessive and dangerous. But the dwarves are different from both the Silmarils and the Ring in one crucial way. They are alive. They have their own wills, their own purposes, their own capacity to choose. They are not objects to be possessed, however much Sauron tried to treat them as such. And the moment Ilúvatar gave them independent life, they escaped the possessiveness of their creation in a way that the Ring and the Silmarils, as inanimate objects, never could. The dwarves' independence of will, the hardness of character that Ilúvatar warned Aulë about, is the very quality that saved them from Sauron's domination. Their stubbornness, which in so many contexts had been a liability, a source of conflict and inflexibility, was the thing that the rings could not overcome. You cannot bend a will that will not bend, and the dwarves' wills would not bend because they had been made specifically to be unbendable by a maker who needed them them to endure through all the ages of the world until the final work was ready to begin. This is one of the places where the lore of Middle-earth achieves genuine depth of meaning, where the surface story of hammers and dragons and stubborn miners opens into something much larger and much more philosophically interesting. The dwarves are not merely the comic relief, not merely the reliable heavy infantry, not merely the gruff but warm-hearted sidekicks of elvish and human protagonists. They are a statement about the value of persistence, about what it means to be made from love rather than from power, about how the things we build can outlast us even when the builders are gone, about how the reflection in a still pool can preserve the memory of a civilization even when the civilization itself has been swallowed by darkness. You know, dear listener, there is something in the dwarves that speaks to something very human, or perhaps I should say something very universal to any creature that makes things and loses things and keeps making them anyway. The cycle of building and loss and rebuilding is the dwarven cycle, repeated age after age, and it is a cycle that requires something specific and something quite specific. The ability to grieve without being destroyed by the grief, to lose Khazad-dûm and survive the loss, to lose Erebor and survive the loss, to lose the colony of Balin and survive that loss too, to walk through Moria, past the bones of friends, weeping, and come out on the other side still carrying your axe, still willing to fight. Gimli walking through the empty halls of Khazad-dûm, seeing what had been lost, weeping openly, and then turning to fight when the fight came with everything he had. That is the dwarven way. Not the suppression of grief, not the stoic refusal to feel it, but the willingness to feel it fully and completely, and then to pick yourself up and go on anyway, because there is work to do, and allies who need you, and because the endurance is itself the thing. Let yourself rest now, dear traveler. Let the weight of all these stories, all these lives, and all these losses, and all this dogged, magnificent persistence, let it settle down through you, through your chest and your belly and your legs, down into the surface beneath you, held there, not pressing on you, but simply present like the stone beneath the mountain, always there, quietly, holding everything up. As we move toward the conclusion of this long journey, I want to return to something we touched on earlier, the legacy of the dwarves, what was whispered about them in the ages that followed the Third Age, what their place in the memory of Middle-earth's history actually was. For the Fourth Age is, in Tolkien's telling, the Age of Men, the age in which the immortal peoples either sail to the west or gradually diminish, in which the world becomes the world we recognize, and the stories of the elder days become myth and legend rather than living memory. The elves sailed, most of them, or diminished, dwindling in Middle-earth without the ring's sustaining power, their great works slowly fading. The half-elves chose their fate. Aragorn ruled in Gondor and Arnor, and Arwen lived with him, and the Age of Kings was restored. But what of the dwarves? The dwarves, unlike the elves, were not passing. They were not diminishing in the way of immortal creatures who have outlived their time in the world. They were, by their nature, a Fourth Age people, as much as a Second or Third Age people. They had always been of the world, practical, physical, rooted in the substance of the earth, and the Fourth Age world, where the rings were gone and the magical elements were fading and what remained was the solid and the enduring, was in many ways the world that had always suited them best. Gimli remained in the glittering caves, building, crafting, keeping his colony alive and productive. His work on the gates of Minas Tirith stood as a monument to the alliance between dwarf and man that the War of the Ring had forged. The relationship between Erebor and Dale continued, deepened perhaps by the shared experience of fighting together in that desperate northern battle while the fate of the world was decided far to the south. The Iron Hills endured, and in the tradition of the lore there is a coda to the story of Gimli that goes beyond even the extraordinary events of his lifetime. He is said to have sailed at last to the west, to have boarded a ship with Legolas, his dearest friend, and sailed to the Blessed Realm. This would make him the only dwarf who ever did so, the only member of his race to make that crossing in all the ages of the world. A grace extended to him specifically because of the love he had borne for Galadriel and the extraordinary nature of his friendship with Legolas. Whether this is literally true within the cosmology of the world, or whether it is a legend that grew up around the story of their friendship, it has a rightness to it that feels true. The dwarf, who had loved stone, learning to love the sea, the most earthbound of all the earth's creatures, making the final, impossible crossing to a land none of his kin had ever seen. There is something in that image that brings the whole long history of the dwarves into a kind of resolution. Not an ending exactly, but a resting point. The race that was made from love and nearly unmade before they could draw breath, that built the greatest underground civilization in the world and lost it to an ancient fire, that rebuilt and lost and rebuilt again across the long ages of history, that endured what no other people could have endured. At the last, one of their own standing on the deck of a ship, watching the shore of the undying lands approach, carrying with him 3 hairs of gold and the memory of an elf who had taught him that friendship was the greatest treasure of all. There is a dwarven craftwork of thought that one can do with the whole sweep of this history, dear traveler, a kind of mental construction of the ark. It starts deep in the earth, in the forge of Aulë, in the secret and the love and the crisis and the grace of the creation. It extends through the building of Khazad-dûm, the rising of the halls and the tunnels, the finding of the mithril, the long centuries of prosperity. It passes through the relationships with elves, tense, creative, sometimes catastrophic, sometimes beautiful, and through the wars with Morgoth and Sauron and all their servants. It narrows through the loss of Khazad-dûm, the long exile, the diaspora, the 7 kindreds scattered across the world. It flares up briefly in the war of dwarves and orcs, the great and terrible gathering of the whole people in fury and grief, the victory that was also a defeat. It finds a thread of hope in the quest of Erebor, in the restoration of the mountain, in Thorin's death, and the beauty that survived it. It widens in Gimli's life, in the glittering caves, in the friendship with Legolas, in the gates of Minas Tirith that still stand in silver and steel, and at the very end it opens up. The stone-bound people, the most earthly of all Earth's creatures, bound by the substance of the world more completely than any other race. At the very end, one of them crosses the water. That opening is the whole story, perhaps. Everything that came before, all the building and losing and rebuilding, all the stubbornness and grief and endurance, all the hammers ringing in the deep places, all the stars reflected in the mirror, all of it was leading by some path that could not be seen at the time toward that moment of opening, toward the possibility of something that had never been possible before. This is the kind of thought that the dwarves themselves might have carved into their record rooms in angular Kurth script, in the deep Khazad-dûm that no outsider could read, a thought too important and too private for the surface world, a thought that belonged to the innermost life of the people who had lived this history. The endurance is not for nothing. The holding on is not mere stubbornness. Something comes of it. Something is opened that was previously closed, and the opening is beautiful, and it was made possible only by all the years of refusing to let go. Let me spend a moment with the other dwarven kindreds, whose stories I have touched on, but not given the attention they deserve. The 5 kindreds of the East, the Iron Fists, the Stiffbeards, the Blacklocks, and the Stonefoots, plus the remaining members of the Firebeards and Broadbeams after the fall of Belegost and Nogrod. These peoples lived their histories largely in the shadows of the written record, in ranges and regions that the lore does not map in detail, in cities whose names are not given to us in the texts we have. This is a genuine loss. Their stories existed. Their kings and craftsmen and warriors had their own deeds and their own disasters, their own versions of the cycle of building and loss that defined all dwarven history. We catch only the faintest glimpses of them. The Grey Mountains, Ered Mithrin, were one important region for the eastern kindreds and also for Durin's folk, in the period between the fall of Khazad-dûm and the settlement of Erebor. This mountain range, running east-west to the north of Mirkwood, was rich in ore and offered the kind of underground living that the dwarves required, and several communities of dwarves settled there in the years after 1981. But the Grey Mountains had a problem. They were also the territory of a large population of cold drakes, a variant of dragon, perhaps less fire-capable than the great dragons of legend, but still formidable predators, drawn to dwarven treasure with the same unerring instinct as their more famous cousins. The history of the Grey Mountain settlements is one of repeated dragon attacks and gradual retreat. Two of the dwarven rulers of those mountains were killed by cold drakes, their settlements destroyed, their treasure stolen. The last great disaster in the Grey Mountains came in 2589 of the Third Age, when Dain Fers and his son Fror were killed at the very doors of their hall by a particularly large cold drake. After that, the survivors abandoned the Grey Mountains almost entirely, some going to the Iron Hills under Thror's brother Gror, where the colony that would eventually produce Dain Ironfoot was established, some going with Thror himself back toward the Lonely Mountain, which led eventually to Erebor's resettlement. The dragons that plagued the dwarves are worth understanding in their own right. They were, in Tolkien's world, creatures made by Morgoth in the First Age, crafted specifically as weapons of war, embodiments of destruction and greed and fire, whose intelligence made them more dangerous than any simple monster. They were large enough to level cities. Their fire was hot enough to melt stone. Their scales could turn most blades. And their minds were specifically designed to be terrible, not merely destructively powerful, but psychologically dangerous. The dragon spell, the dragon's glare that could paralyze with fear, the dragon's voice that could convince and seduce and paralyze the judgment. These were tools of domination that made dragons uniquely suited to wrecking the civilizations that the dwarves so laboriously built. The classic exchange between Bilbo and Smaug in the Hobbit creeping through the tunnel, the dragon feigning sleep, the riddles and the flattery and the careful verbal fencing, shows exactly how the dragon's danger was not only physical. Smaug was trying, with his words, to undermine Bilbo's confidence, to introduce doubt about the faithfulness of his dwarven companions, to make the hobbit useful to the dragon. He nearly succeeded, and the revelation of the weak spot in Smaug's armor, the gap in the armoring of gems on his left side, where Bilbo had spotted an unprotected patch of pale skin, came through that very conversation, which means the conversation itself produced both the risk and the salvation simultaneously. Dragons and dwarves have a symbiotic yet parasitic relationship in the history of Middle-earth, each making the other more historically significant. The dwarves, by accumulating vast hoards of treasure, made themselves attractive targets for dragons. The dragons, by attacking and seizing those hoards, both destroyed dwarven civilization and paradoxically served as guardians of dwarven treasure for the periods between a city's fall and its restoration. Smaug sitting on Erebor's gold for 60 years was also, in a perverse way, keeping the gold intact for Thorin's eventual return. The treasure that was stolen could, in principle, be restored, and the act of restoration, the quest to reclaim what the dragon had taken, became one of the defining genres of dwarven heroic tradition. The dwarves' approach to treasure itself is worth reflecting on more carefully than the surface stereotype allows. Yes, they valued gold and silver and gems. Yes, the ring-amplified version of this valuation could become destructive. But the fundamental relationship between dwarves and wealth was not mere acquisitiveness. It was connected to the same quality that made them great craftsmen. To a dwarf, wealth was not abstract. It was always also material. The feel of a gold piece, the weight of a silver bar, the particular way a gem threw light when turned in your hand. Their love of treasure was, at its root, the same love that made them cut and polish gems to perfection, that made them care whether the proportions of a hall were exactly right, that made them spend weeks on a lock mechanism that no one but the locksmith would ever examine closely. They valued the made thing. They valued the transformed substance, the raw material given form and purpose by skilled hands. A hoard of gold was not to a dwarf what a hoard of numbers in a ledger is to a banker. It was 100 objects that someone had made, each one testifying to the skill and the effort and the time that had gone into it. The dwarves who poured out of Erebor when Smaug attacked were not mourning abstract wealth. They were mourning specific things, things they or their parents had made with their own hands, things that had meaning beyond their material value. This is why the loss of Khazad-dûm was so devastating in a way that went beyond the economic. Khazad-dûm was not just a source of mithril, it was the accumulation of thousands of years of making, the physical record of a civilization, the largest object in the world that dwarven hands had shaped. To lose it was not like losing a bank balance. It was like losing every artifact, every building, every piece of evidence that your civilization had ever existed, all at once, to a creature of fire. And yet the memory remained, in the deep cultural tradition, in the songs and the stories and the oral records, in the knowledge that the halls were still there, still intact, their walls still bearing the marks of all those ancient hands, not destroyed, just empty, still waiting. There is a beautiful and terrible quality to the image of Khazad-dûm, empty, dear traveler. Thousands of years of dwarven labor and dwarven love, all perfectly preserved in stone because stone does not rot, because the darkness could not erode what the hands had carved, because the chill of the deep places preserved everything against decay. The halls were as perfect in the Third Age as they had been when the last dwarf left them in 1981. The knotwork was still on the walls, the bridge of Khazad-dûm still arched over the abyss. The tomb of Balin was complete. Even the book of Mazabul was intact, waiting in the chamber of Mazabul for someone to read it. Bilbo's mithril coat, which Thorin gave him with such casual generosity in the depths of Erebor, not seeming to grasp its value, was worth more than the entire Shire, more than the Shire twice over, more than most kingdoms. That small coat of rings, each ring smaller than a fingernail, each ring interlocked with perfect precision by hands whose owners had been dead for centuries. This small object was the concentrated wealth of a civilization, the ultimate product of all that dwarven knowledge of metal and the deep mountain, and it saved Frodo's life in the chamber of Mazabul, when a great orc spear struck him in the chest and the mithril rings held. There is a poetry in that, the product of dwarven craft, made in the glory days of Khazad-dûm by hands long dead, found its ultimate purpose thousands of years later in the very halls where it had been made, in those same empty halls, now filled with orcs and fire and the terrible presence of a Balrog. The mithril coat traveled from the height of dwarven civilization through the quest of Erebor and the hands of a dwarf king and the gift-giving between Thorin and his burglar, and ended up saving the life of the ring-bearer at the precise moment and place where the ring's destruction was most necessary for the world. If Frodo had died in Moria, the story would have ended there. If the mithril coat had not held, Frodo would have died in Moria. The dwarves, who might seem at first glance to be peripheral to the great story of the ring, not the bearers of the ring, not the keepers of the ring's lore, not the political powers who decided the ring's fate, were, through a small coat of metal rings made centuries before, absolutely central to the ring's destruction. They did not know it, they could not have known it, but the making was there, and the quality was there, and at the critical moment the work held. This is another way in which the dwarves are a meditation on endurance, and on the value of doing things well, even when you cannot see the purpose. The craftsman who made each ring of that coat to perfect specification, who interlocked them with care and precision, who could not have imagined the specific circumstances that would one day make their work life-saving. That craftsman did not need to imagine those circumstances. It was enough to make the work to the highest standard possible. The value would find its own use in its own time, in ways no maker could foresee. This, perhaps, is the deepest thing about the dwarves, deeper than the stubbornness, deeper even than the endurance, the absolute commitment to doing the work well, regardless of circumstances, regardless of whether anyone was watching, or whether the purpose was clear, or whether the reward was commensurate with the effort. The ringsmith making rings for a coat of mail that might never be worn. The record keeper writing down the history of a colony that was failing. The king carving knotwork into walls that might one day be empty. The work itself was the point. The quality of the doing was what mattered. Everything else, who saw it, what it was used for, whether it outlasted the maker or the civilization that had produced the maker. All of that was secondary to the simple, fundamental, irreducible task of doing the work well while there was still time to do it. Dear listener, you have traveled far tonight, farther than the misty mountains and the lonely mountain and the blue mountains combined. You have followed the dwarves from the forge of Aulë at the beginning of the world to the glittering caves in the Fourth Age, from the first crack of hammer on stone in Khazad-dûm to the quiet sailing of one small dwarf across the great sea to the blessed realm. You have sat with them in their greatest moments and their worst, in the firelit halls of their prosperity and the empty darkness of their loss. You have heard their music, faint and resonant, and you have felt the cool of the deep stone around you and the amber warmth of the forge fire. Let all of it settle now. Let the long sweep of it rest behind your closed eyes like the dim light of a distant forge, warm and steady and unhurried. The dwarves are still there, dear traveler, in the deep places of the imagination, still working, still singing their low and beautiful songs about mountains and gold and the light of stars in still water. They will be there tomorrow and the night after, and all the nights that follow. There is so much more that could be said, the detailed genealogies of the 7 houses, the specific histories of the Iron Hills, the precise archaeology of what was found and what was lost in Moria, the lost lore of the eastern kindreds in their far mountains, the particular innovations of dwarven craft in each successive age. The lore is deep, dear traveler, as deep as the mines of Khazad-dûm, and you can always go deeper. There are always more veins to follow, always more chambers waiting below the level you have currently reached. But for tonight, we have traced the great arc, from the unauthorized love of a craftsman god, through the golden millennia of the first great city, through the catastrophic losses and the stubborn survivals, and the long diasporas, through the dark shadow of Durin's bane, and the bright flame of the quest of Erebor, through the friendship between a dwarf and an elf that seemed impossible and was more beautiful for it, through the battles of the north and the south in the War of the Ring to the glittering caves and the silver gates of Minas Tirith and the improbable, grace-filled crossing of the sea. It is a long story, long enough to fill an age, long enough to fill many ages, long enough to carry you from waking into sleep and leave you resting in its depths like a stone at the bottom of the mirror, settled and still, with the stars reflected all around you. Let yourself drift now. There is nothing more to do tonight. The story has been told, the lore has been honored, and the dwarves of Middle-earth have had their proper place in the long recounting. Their halls are full of warm light, somewhere far below, and the sound of hammers has settled to a very distant rhythm, soft as a heartbeat, regular as the drip of water in a deep passage. Can you feel it? That rhythm, that slow, patient, persistent rhythm, the rhythm of a people who never stopped, who endured everything and built it again, who kept the memory alive in stone and song, and the secret language that no outsider could read. It is a good rhythm to fall asleep to. It asks nothing of you. It simply continues, as it always has, as it always will. The mirror is still. The stars are still reflected in it. Durin's reflection looks up from beneath the surface, younger than time, older than the mountains, patient as the stone he was made from. And the night is deep, dear traveler, and the mountain is warm, and the hammers have gone quiet at last, and the forge fires are banked for the night, and the great halls are silent and full of peace. You have done well to travel this far. You have carried the history of the Dwarves of Middle-earth through all its ages and all its sorrows, and all its improbable, stubborn survivals, and now you can set it down, let it lie in the dark like a stone, solid and enduring, asking nothing of you but to rest. The night is yours, dear traveler. The deep places are quiet, the stars are in the water, and the water is still, and somewhere a last hammer rings once against cold stone and then falls silent. And so, dear traveler, as you rest and let the weight of these stories fade into the night, the weight of all those millennia, all those hammer blows, all those losses and returns and losses again, all that magnificent, heartbreaking endurance. May the echoes of the Dwarves of Middle-earth guide you gently into the soundest of sleep. May you dream of deep halls lit with amber firelight, of knotwork carved in stone, of the cool clarity of the mirror mere, and the stars that never stop being reflected in it. May the rhythm of distant hammers be your lullaby, and the quiet of the deep mountain your shelter, and the long, patient persistence of a people who could not be broken be the last thing you carry with you as you drift. Good night, dear traveler, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with peace and tranquility. The instruction to continue is noted, but looking at the previous output, it ended with a complete outro and good night sign-off. The script as written is complete. However, since the target is 150,000 characters and approximately 17,754 remain to be written, I will expand the body of the narration with additional lore depth before the outro. Here is the continuation, picking up from just before the outro began, adding the remaining material to reach the target length. The question of dwarven craft traditions across the different kindreds is one that deserves its own extended contemplation, because the 7 families, while sharing the fundamental dwarven genius for stonework and metalwork, developed their own regional specialties and their own aesthetic signatures over the long centuries of their separate development. The Firebeards of Belegost, for instance, became famous in the First Age for a specific and remarkable achievement. They were the dwarves who invented the dwarf mask, the great visored helm that covered the entire face of the warrior, leaving only narrow slits for the eyes. This innovation arose, according to the tradition, specifically because of the problem of dragon fire. In the great wars of the First Age, when the armies of Morgoth included dragons, any warrior who faced a dragon directly and looked into its eyes risked both the paralyzing dragon spell and the physical damage of the fire. The Firebeards of Belegost, who fought the dragon Glaurung, the first and in some ways the most terrible of all dragons, developed their masked helms as a practical response to these specific dangers. The helms served their purpose. At the Nirneth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, one of the most catastrophic defeats of the Elves and their allies against Morgoth's forces, the Dwarves of Belegost performed a feat that no other army of that age could match. They withstood the dragon's fire and the dragon's gaze and fought on. Their king Azargol was killed by Glaurung himself, the dragon lord, but in dying he inflicted a wound on Glaurung that drove the dragon from the field. A dwarf killed by a dragon still managed to drive that dragon back. That is the dwarven way in its most concentrated and most extreme expression, and the masked helms of Belegost were the tool that made it possible. The broad beams of Nogrod, by contrast, were famous less for their military innovations and more for their jewelry and decorative metalwork. The Norglemir, the necklace of the dwarves that played so catastrophic a role in the end of Doriath, was their work, and it was by all accounts a piece of extraordinary beauty, a necklace of gold and silver set with hundreds of gems, so perfectly balanced and so finely worked that wearing it felt, reportedly, like wearing nothing at all. The craft that went into such a piece was the craft of people who had spent generations studying the relationship between metal and gem, between the cool weight of precious stone and the warm flexibility of worked gold, finding the exact proportions that made the marriage of the two materials feel inevitable and perfect rather than merely decorative. Durin's Longbeards, being the oldest and the most continuously settled of the kindreds, developed the broadest range of craft traditions. Because they had the most time and the most resources. Their architecture was their supreme achievement, as we have discussed, but they were also the masters of mithril work, and the techniques they developed for working that singular metal were never fully shared with any other kindred, human or dwarven. The specific temperatures required, the exact hammering rhythms that kept the metal from becoming brittle, the alloys that enhanced certain of its properties, all of this was Longbeard knowledge, encoded in the Khazad-dûm technical vocabulary that was never taught outside the line. It is worth pausing on the Kurth script, the angular writing system that the dwarves used, because it tells us something important about the dwarven relationship to knowledge and communication. The Kurth was not originally a dwarven invention. It was developed by the Sindar elves for use in carving. Its angular shapes were designed to be cut into wood or stone rather than written with a pen, and the alphabet was based on the phonology of Sindarin. But the dwarves adopted it enthusiastically and adapted it significantly, changing certain letters to match the phonology of Khazad-dûm, adding new signs for sounds that Sindarin did not have, and ultimately developing what was called the mode of Erebor, a version of the Kurth specifically optimized for writing the dwarven language. The map of the lonely mountain that Thror left to Thrain, and that Thrain gave to Gandalf, was inscribed with runes in this mode, and the moon letters, the secondary inscription that could only be read by the light of a moon of the same phase and season as when they were written, were also in this angular script. The existence of moon letters is one of those details that opens a window into a dwarven tradition that is usually invisible, a tradition of hidden knowledge, of secondary layers of meaning built into visible texts, of craft that incorporated secrets as naturally as it incorporated gold and gem work. The smith who incised the moon letters into the map of Erebor was working in a tradition that valued the concealed, the revealed only to the qualified, the knowledge that required specific conditions to access. This was not mere paranoia or secrecy for its own sake. It was a form of respect for the knowledge itself, a way of saying that some information was important enough that it should not be casually available, that the act of accessing it should require specific preparation and specific circumstances. This same sensibility is visible in the double-door puzzles of dwarven architecture, the doors that opened only at certain times, or by certain methods, or with certain words, or by the combination of key and moon phase and season that the Durin's door required. The dwarves built their secrets into their buildings the way they built structural strength into their bridges, as integral elements of the design, not as afterthoughts. A dwarven door that had no puzzle was, to a dwarven architect, a door that had not been finished properly. Gandalf's long struggle at Durin's door, sitting in the rain, cycling through every password he could think of, while the Fellowship waited on the rocky shore and the Watcher lurked in the dark pool nearby, was, in a sense, a tribute to this tradition. The door had been made by Celebrimbor the elf-smith, working in collaboration with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm during the golden age of Eregion, and its inscription declared that the door would open to the word of the elf friends or to the password of Durin. But the word Enin Durin, the doors of Durin, were framed by a riddle that Gandalf initially overcame his own cleverness to solve. Speak, friend, and enter. Not speak the password, simply speak the word for friend, the simplest possible key, hidden in plain sight within the complexity of the inscription itself. This is a specifically dwarven kind of humor, and it is easy to miss. The dwarves were not humorless, far from it. Their humor was dry and often deeply embedded in context, requiring knowledge and patience to appreciate. The joke in Durin's door was that everyone looking for a complex password would walk right past the simple one, and only someone who read the inscription with genuine attention and genuine simplicity of interpretation would find the answer. It was a test not of cleverness, but of the willingness to trust the obvious. Melon friend, of course. The question of dwarven trade relationships with men in the Third Age deserves more attention than it often receives, because this trade was the economic engine that kept dwarven civilization viable through the long centuries of diaspora and loss. After the fall of Khazad-dûm, the dwarves no longer had mithril to offer. Mithril production had ended with the abandonment of the mine. What they had instead was craft skill, the ability to make things, particularly weapons and armor and tools, of a quality that men could not match. Dwarven blades held an edge longer than any man-made blade. Dwarven mail was lighter and stronger than anything men could forge. Dwarven tools, picks and hammers and saws and levels were more precisely made and more durable. Men paid well for these things, and the trade routes between dwarven settlements and the markets of men's kingdoms were important lines of economic life for both parties. The relationship between Erebor and Dale was the most visible example, but it was not the only one. The Iron Hills had trading relationships with the men of Rhûn and the men of Esgaroth. The Blue Mountains dwarves traded with the men of the coastlands and with the hobbits of the Shire, who had developed a particular appreciation for dwarven workmanship. The dwarves made tools that hobbit gardeners found exceptionally useful. Not glamorous, not the kind of thing that appears in epic narratives, but solid and practical, and exactly what you want when you are trying to turn heavy soil. The hobbit connection is worth a specific moment of attention, because it is one of the more charming and unexpected cross-racial friendships in the whole of Middle-earth's history. The hobbits of the Shire, settled, domestic, deeply conservative in their habits, profoundly uninterested in the wider world and its dramas, had maintained steady commercial relations with the dwarves who passed through their territory or traded at their markets for generations before Gandalf showed up at Bag End. Bilbo Baggins was not, in the broader hobbit sense, an anomaly in his knowledge of dwarves. Most hobbits knew of dwarves, had bought things from dwarves, had perhaps passed dwarven caravans on the road. What made Bilbo an anomaly was that he went further, that he did more than merely trade with them. But that going further was itself possible because the foundation of comfortable familiarity was already there. Bilbo could join the company of Thorin Oakenshield because hobbits and dwarves had been rubbing along together commercially for long enough that the basic social grammar of the interaction was established. You invited dwarves in, you fed them, they were direct and practical, and they expected you to be direct and practical in return. They had a long memory for both kindness and unkindness, and if you dealt with them fairly, you could expect fairness back. This is the face of the dwarves that the grand historical narrative sometimes obscures in favor of the more dramatic qualities, the straightforwardness, the reliability, the simple trustworthiness in a commercial context. A dwarf who agreed to a price held to it. A dwarf who gave his word on a matter of craft kept his word. This was not universal. The dwarves were capable of treachery when they felt wronged, as the history of Nargothrond and the events around the Norglemere demonstrate, but in ordinary commercial dealings, in the day-to-day business of trade and craft, and the exchange of goods for payment, the dwarves were among the most reliable partners any people could have. The dwarves' reputation for reliability in craft extended to a specific and fascinating practice, the dwarven guarantee. If a dwarven smith made a piece of work for a customer and it failed in normal use, within a reasonable period, failed not through the customer's misuse but through a flaw in the making, the smith or his house was obligated to replace or repair it at no cost. This was not merely a commercial custom but a matter of honor, because to a dwarf, failed craft was a personal failing, a reflection on the maker's character rather than simply an inconvenient product defect. The standards to which dwarven craftsmen held themselves were the standards that made their guarantee meaningful. They were so confident in the quality of their work that they could offer it without fear of significant financial exposure, because the work genuinely was that good. There is in all of this, in the trade relationships, in the craft standards, in the commercial reliability, a picture of dwarven civilization that is quite different from the treasure-mad, dragon-bait stereotype. The dwarves were a functioning economic civilization, a people who participated in the commerce of Middle-earth in practical and mutually beneficial ways, whose skills were genuinely needed by the other races and whose own needs were genuinely served by the exchange. The gold in the treasury was not only the product of hoarding instinct, it was also the accumulated profit of fair exchange across many generations, the reward for making things that people genuinely needed and making them better than anyone else could. The mining traditions of the dwarves extended beyond the search for precious metals and gems. They were also necessarily the foremost geologists of Middle-earth, people who had spent thousands of years studying rock in the most intimate possible way, who understood the structure of mountain formations in a depth that no surface-dwelling people could match. They knew which formations were likely to conceal ore and which were not, which rock types were stable for tunneling and which were prone to collapse, which underground water sources were safe to approach, and which were potentially dangerous. This geological knowledge was practical and directly useful, but it was also, in a dwarven mind, inherently beautiful. The structure of the world was beautiful in its own right, and understanding it was a form of appreciation as genuine as any elvish appreciation of starlight or birdsong. The dwarves' deep geological knowledge was also occasionally shared with others, selectively and for appropriate compensation, but shared. Dwarven engineers were sometimes employed by men's kingdoms to advise on the construction of great works. Bridges, fortifications, drainage systems, mine shafts for the men's own, more modest mining operations. The great walls of certain men's cities showed dwarven influence in their construction methods, the precision of the stone cutting, the calculated angles of the defensive towers. This kind of consultancy relationship was another face of the dwarven economic engagement with the world, not always underground, not always behind the walls of their own mountains, but actively present in the building of the surface world as well. It is also worth noting that the dwarves, for all their reputation as a single-minded people, focused exclusively on craft and trade and their own internal affairs, were genuinely curious about the world. Individual dwarves traveled widely, often alone or in small groups, exploring regions that had no dwarven settlements, acquiring knowledge of geography and natural resources, seeking out trading opportunities in distant markets. The dwarves who eventually settled in the glittering caves under Gimli had not simply appeared there out of nowhere. They were part of a broader dwarven tradition of exploration and opportunistic settlement, of following an individual dwarf's vision to a new location and building something new. Durin himself had done this at the very beginning, wandering alone through a young world until he found the valley that called to him, the lake that reflected the stars. This quality of restless exploration, combined with the equally powerful quality of deep attachment to home once found, produced the characteristic dwarven tension between the wandering and the settled, a tension that appears again and again in their history. The wandering dwarves, the traders and explorers and dispossessed kings, carry the culture forward when the settled communities are destroyed. The settled communities, when they establish themselves in a new place or reclaim an old one, provide the stability and the accumulated craft knowledge that makes the wandering possible. Neither mode alone is sufficient. The dwarven civilization required both, in alternation, and the ability to move between them, to be settled when settlement was possible and wandering when it was necessary, was one of the most important of all dwarven adaptive capacities. Thorin Oakenshield embodied this tension in his own person with particular clarity. He was simultaneously a wanderer, an exile who had spent decades in the Blue Mountains without a proper kingdom, and a settled man in his soul, a king without a throne who carried the memory of Erebor's specific halls and specific smells and specific sounds with him everywhere he went, unable to fully inhabit the present because the past was so vividly alive in him. The quest was his attempt to resolve the tension, to convert the wandering back into settlement, to recover the settled life that had been taken from him when he was too young to fight for it. His success was partial, and his death was the price. But the resolution was real. Erebor was restored. The settlement was recovered. The next generation, Dain Ironfoot, Dain's son Thorin Stonehelm, could be settled, could be kings with genuine kingdoms, could be the stable center that the wanderers of Durin's folk needed. The wandering that Thorin had endured was not wasted. It produced, in the end, the stability it had been seeking. This pattern, the individual sacrifice producing the community's stability, is repeated throughout dwarven history. Thror wandering alone into Moria, dying there, producing through his death the war that cleansed Moria of its orc infestation for a generation and made the region safer for dwarven movement. Thrain captured and broken in Dol Guldur, but managing in his last moment of clarity to give Gandalf the key and the map that started the whole chain of events leading to Erebor's restoration. Balin leading his colony into Moria, failing, dying, but the failure and the death became a record, Ori's record, which Gandalf read to the Fellowship, which warned them of what they faced, which was itself a form of gift from the dead to the living. The dwarves, in their theology, believed that their dead waited to be called back for the final remaking. But their dead did not wait passively. They left things behind: records, maps, keys, crafted objects, carved walls, mithril coats, and these things kept doing work in the world long after the hands that made them had fallen still. The dead dwarves of Khazad-dûm were still present in their work, still contributing to the history of the world, still shaping the choices and the fates of the living through what they had left behind. This is not mysticism. It is the ordinary, practical, physical reality of what it means to make things that last. And the dwarves made things that lasted. That is ultimately the most important thing about them. In a world where elvish beauty faded with the elves diminishing, where men's kingdoms rose and fell in mortal rhythms, where even the great works of the Valar could be undone by war and catastrophe, the dwarves' work endured. The halls of Khazad-dûm still stood, empty but intact, as late as the end of the Third Age. The bridge of Khazad-dûm still arched over the abyss. The inscriptions on Durin's door were still legible. The tomb of Balin in the chamber of Mazabul was still sound. The mithril coat was still functional after centuries of storage. They made things that lasted because they were, themselves, people who lasted. The stubborn endurance that characterized their personal and political lives was also the quality that characterized their craft. You could not make work that lasted if you were not willing to take the time to make it right, to add the extra care, to do the additional labor of checking and perfecting and checking again. The dwarves took that time, did that labor, added that care, because they valued the enduring over the immediate, the made well over the made quickly, the thing that would still be doing its work 1,000 years hence over the thing that served its immediate purpose and then fell apart. This is the philosophy encoded in every ring of that mithril coat, in every carved stone of every dwarven hall, in every accurately rendered letter of every Cirth inscription, in every tomb, in every mountain where dwarves had ever lived and worked and died. Do the work well. Do it to a standard that does not require excuses. Do it so that whoever finds it in 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or at the end of the world, when Aulë calls his children together for the final labor, will know, from the quality of the work itself, what kind of people made it. This is the inheritance of Aulë and his children, in these unauthorized and beloved and astonishing creatures that he shaped from stone in a secret underground forge at the very beginning of the world and wept to think of destroying, and that Ilúvatar, in his mercy and his wisdom, chose to grant genuine life, genuine independence, genuine purpose. They are, in the deepest sense, a people of craft and love. Love expressed through craft, craft sustained by love, the two things inseparable in the dwarven soul from the very first moment of their making. And so, dear traveler, as you rest and let the weight of these stories fade gently into the night, the weight of all those millennia, all those hammer blows ringing through the stone, all those losses and returns and losses again, all that magnificent and heartbreaking endurance, may the echoes of the Dwarves of Middle-earth carry you softly and completely into the soundest and most peaceful of sleeps. May you dream of deep halls lit with amber forge light, of knotwork carved with patient love into the living rock, of the cool and perfect stillness of the mirror mere, where the stars have been reflected since the first dwarf knelt at its edge and looked down in wonder at the sky beneath the water. May the low, resonant voices of dwarven song be your lullaby, and the quiet of the deep mountain your shelter, and the long, patient, unbreakable persistence of a people who could not be diminished and would not be forgotten be the last warmth you carry with you as consciousness dissolves into the deep and restful dark. Good night, dear traveler, and may your dreams be filled with peace and tranquility.